Deep beneath the desert sands, carved into the walls of one of the most sacred temples ever constructed by human hands, there are images that have stunned researchers, baffled historians, and ignited one of the most extraordinary debates in the entire study of the ancient world. They show what appears to be enormous glass bulbs held aloft by pillars, with serpentine filaments glowing inside them, connected by what look unmistakably like braided cables running to a box that could be a power source. These carvings are not modern, they are not forgeries, they are not the product of digital manipulation or artistic fantasy. They are real. They exist right now, etched into limestone walls that were constructed over 2,000 years ago, in a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor, in the ancient Egyptian city known as Dendera. And they raise a question so profound, so disruptive to everything we think we know about the history of technology, that mainstream academia has struggled for decades to provide a satisfying answer. Did the ancient Egyptians possess electric lighting? Did they understand and harness electricity thousands of years before the modern world stumbled upon it? Were the great temples and underground chambers of Egypt illuminated not by flickering torches or dim oil lamps, but by the steady, clean glow of electric light? Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand what was found at Dendera and why it has provoked such a firestorm of curiosity and controversy, we need to begin with the temple itself. The Dendera Temple complex sits on the western bank of the Nile River, roughly 60 kilometers north of the ancient city of Luxor, in what is today the Egyptian governorate of Kina. It is one of the best preserved temple complexes in all of Egypt, and that preservation is part of the reason its secrets have survived to reach our eyes in the modern age. The complex covers approximately 40,000 square meters, and while there are multiple structures within its boundaries, the crown jewel is the Temple of Hathor, a colossal monument to the ancient Egyptian goddess of love, beauty, music, fertility, and the sky. Hathor was one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. She was associated with joy and celebration, with motherhood and femininity, but also with the cosmos itself. She was sometimes depicted as a cow, sometimes as a woman with cow ears, and sometimes as a woman wearing a headdress of cow horns cradling a solar disk. Her worship was ancient even by ancient Egyptian standards. References to Hathor stretch back to the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, and the site at Dendera appears to have been sacred to her for thousands of years before the temple that stands today was constructed. The current Temple of Hathor was built primarily during the Ptolemaic period, that fascinating era when Egypt was ruled by a dynasty of Greek-speaking pharaohs descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Construction is believed to have begun around 54 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy XII Auletes, the father of the famous Cleopatra VII. Work continued through the Roman period, with additions and modifications made by various Roman emperors including Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. But while the structure that stands today dates to this relatively late period in Egyptian history, the builders themselves claim they were working from far older plans. Inscriptions within the temple state that it was built according to a design that had been found in ancient writings dating back to the time of the followers of Horus, a mythical age that Egyptians placed thousands of years before their own recorded history. Whether this claim is literally true or represents a form of religious legitimization, it tells us something important about how the Egyptians viewed this site. They considered it profoundly ancient, connected to the deepest roots of their civilization. The temple is a masterpiece of ancient architecture. Its hypostyle hall features 24 massive columns, each crowned with a four-sided capital carved with the face of Hathor. The ceilings are decorated with astronomical scenes of breathtaking complexity, including the famous Dendera zodiac, a planisphere depicting the constellations known to the ancient Egyptians, which was removed by French explorers in the 19th century and now resides in the Louvre Museum in Paris. The walls throughout the temple are covered with elaborate reliefs depicting religious ceremonies, mythological narratives, offerings to the gods, and the activities of pharaohs and priests. It is, by any measure, one of the great artistic and architectural achievements of the ancient world. But the images that concern us in this documentary are not found in the grand public halls of the temple. They are found in something far more hidden, far more mysterious. They are found in the crypts. Beneath the main temple structure and within certain walls of the building itself, there exists a network of narrow chambers and passageways that Egyptologists refer to as crypts. These are not burial chambers in the traditional sense. No mummies were interred here, no sarcophagi placed within them. Instead, these cramped spaces appear to have served as repositories for sacred objects, ritual implements, and perhaps the most valuable treasures of the temple. Some of these crypts are so narrow that a person can barely squeeze through them. Others open into small rooms where a few people could stand, surrounded on all sides by intricately carved walls. The ceilings are low, the spaces are claustrophobic, and every available surface is covered with relief carvings and hieroglyphic inscriptions of extraordinary detail and precision. There are multiple crypts in the Dendera Temple complex, arranged on different levels. Some are subterranean, accessed by narrow staircases leading down beneath the floor of the temple. Others are built into the thickness of the walls themselves, hidden behind panels that could be moved or removed to reveal the secret chambers behind them. The existence of these crypts was known to early explorers of the temple, but it was not until the comprehensive archaeological surveys of the 19th and 20th centuries that they were fully documented and studied. French Egyptologist Émile Chassenat conducted a monumental study of the Dendera Temple in the early 20th century, producing a multi-volume publication that remains the definitive scholarly reference for the temple's inscriptions and reliefs. It is in Chassenat's meticulous documentation that the wider world first became aware of the extraordinary images hidden in the Dendera crypts. The images in question are found primarily in the southernmost crypt on the eastern side of the temple, designated by scholars as Crypt South 1, or sometimes simply as the Southern Crypt. This particular chamber is accessed through a narrow opening in the wall of one of the temple's rear rooms. Inside, the walls are covered with relief carvings that are, at first glance, bewildering. They show a series of scenes featuring large, elongated, bulbous objects that bear an unmistakable resemblance to oversized incandescent light bulbs. These objects are depicted resting on or emerging from what appears to be a lotus flower, and inside each one there is a wavy, serpentine line that extends from one end of the bulb to the other, looking for all the world like the filament inside an electric light. At the base of each bulb there appears to be a socket or fitting, and from this fitting runs what looks like a braided cable or thick cord. This cable extends downward and connects to a box-like object that sits on the ground, an object that some observers have compared to a generator or a battery. Standing near several of these objects are human figures, and in some versions of the scene there appears to be a pillar or column supporting the bulb-like object, reminiscent of a lamp standard or an insulator. In one particularly striking relief, a figure appears to be holding the bulb at an angle, as though adjusting its position, while the cable runs from the base of the object to the box below. The serpentine line inside the bulb is sometimes depicted with a small additional element near one end, which some observers have compared to a bayonet fitting or a terminal connector. When modern eyes look at these images, the visual resemblance to electric lighting technology is immediate and striking. The elongated glass envelope, the internal filament, the cable connection, the terminal box, every major component of a basic electric lighting system appears to be represented. And this is not a matter of a single ambiguous image that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The motif appears repeatedly throughout the crypt, in multiple panels, from multiple angles, with consistent details that seem to reinforce the technological interpretation. It is a coherent visual narrative that, to many observers, tells a story of electrical illumination in ancient Egypt. The first person to seriously propose that the Dendera reliefs depicted ancient electrical technology was not a fringe conspiracy theorist or a self-published amateur. The idea gained significant traction through the work of several independent researchers in the latter half of the 20th century, but it was perhaps most famously and systematically articulated by Peter Krassa and Reinhard Habeck in their work, published in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Krassa and Habeck examined the Dendera reliefs in detail and argued that the conventional Egyptological explanation for the images was inadequate, and that the technological interpretation provided a far more coherent and satisfying reading of the visual evidence. Their argument was straightforward. Look at the images, they said. Look at them without preconceptions, without the assumption that ancient people could not have possessed advanced technology. What do you see? You see light bulbs. You see filaments, you see cables, you see what appears to be a power source. The visual evidence is right there, carved into the stone, preserved for 2,000 years, waiting for a civilization that understood electricity to come along and recognize what was being depicted. But Krassa and Habeck were not the only ones making this argument. The broader ancient astronaut and alternative history movement, which had exploded in popularity following the publication of Erich von Däniken's groundbreaking work in the late 1960s, embraced the Dendera light bulbs as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for advanced ancient technology. Von Däniken himself discussed the reliefs in his writings and lectures, presenting them as part of a wider pattern of evidence, suggesting that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond what mainstream history was willing to acknowledge. The argument resonated with a huge audience because it addressed a genuine mystery. How did the ancient Egyptians light the interiors of their tombs and temples? This is not a trivial question. It is, in fact, one of the most persistent and puzzling practical questions in all of Egyptology. Consider the magnificent painted tombs of the Valley of the Kings, where the walls are covered with elaborate, brightly colored murals depicting scenes from Egyptian mythology, the journey of the soul through the afterlife, and the exploits of the pharaohs. These paintings were executed deep underground, in chambers cut into solid rock, sometimes at the ends of long, winding corridors that descended far below the surface of the earth. The artists who created these masterworks needed light to see what they were doing. They needed consistent, reliable illumination over extended periods because these paintings are not hasty sketches. They are meticulous works of art that would have required days, weeks, or even months of painstaking labor. The conventional explanation is that the Egyptians used simple oil lamps and torches, and indeed, archaeological evidence confirms that oil lamps were widely used throughout ancient Egypt. Small ceramic dishes filled with oil, with a wick placed in the oil to burn, have been found in archaeological contexts throughout the country. Torches made of bundled reeds soaked in animal fat are also attested. But here is the problem that alternative researchers have pointed out repeatedly, and it is a problem that mainstream Egyptology has never fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Fire produces soot. When you burn oil or animal fat in an enclosed space, the combustion process generates carbon particles that rise in the hot air and deposit themselves on every surface they contact. The ceilings of the tombs should be black with soot. The walls should show evidence of smoke damage. The painted surfaces should be obscured or degraded by years of exposure to the byproducts of combustion. And yet, in many of the deepest tombs and chambers, the ceilings are remarkably clean. The paintings are pristine. There is little or no visible evidence of the kind of soot accumulation that prolonged use of oil lamps or torches would inevitably produce. This observation has been made by numerous visitors to the tombs over the centuries, from early European explorers to modern tourists. The ceilings are clean. Where is the soot? Various explanations have been proposed. Perhaps the Egyptians used specially designed oil lamps that produced very little smoke. Perhaps they used mirrors to reflect sunlight from the entrance deep into the interior of the tombs. Perhaps they used some form of bioluminescence or chemical light. Perhaps the tombs were cleaned after the painting was complete. Perhaps the soot has been removed by modern conservation efforts. Each of these explanations has some merit, and each has significant weaknesses. The mirror theory is one of the most frequently cited conventional explanations. It proposes that the Egyptians positioned a series of highly polished copper or bronze mirrors along the corridors of the tombs, each mirror angled to reflect sunlight from one to the next, carrying the light deep underground in a chain of reflections. This is theoretically possible, and experiments have shown that polished bronze can indeed reflect a significant amount of light, but the practical difficulties are enormous. Each reflection reduces the intensity of the light significantly. After just a few reflections, the light would be extremely dim, far too dim to illuminate the kind of detailed painting work seen in the tombs. Moreover, the corridors of many tombs are not straight. They curve, they turn, they descend at angles that would make a chain of mirror reflections extraordinarily difficult to maintain. And there is no archaeological evidence of the mirror stations that this system would require, no marks on the walls where mirrors were mounted, no caches of mirrors found in tomb corridors. The specially designed lamp theory is somewhat more plausible. It is true that some ancient oil lamps were designed to minimize smoke production. Lamps with carefully calibrated wicks using specific types of oil can burn relatively cleanly, and some researchers have pointed out that the ancient Egyptians may have used salt in their lamps, which can reduce soot production. Experiments with replicas of ancient Egyptian lamps have shown that they can indeed burn with relatively little smoke. But relatively little is not none, and over the weeks and months of continuous use that tomb decoration would have required, even a small amount of soot production would accumulate to visible levels, particularly in enclosed, poorly ventilated underground spaces. The cleaning theory proposes that the Egyptians simply cleaned the soot off the ceilings and walls after the painting was complete. This is certainly possible, but it raises its own questions. How do you clean soot off a freshly painted surface without damaging the paint? And more to the point, why would the ceilings of unfinished tombs where the painting was never completed also appear to be free of soot accumulation? These questions are real. They are not fabricated by alternative researchers seeking to promote a fringe theory. They represent genuine gaps in our understanding of ancient Egyptian practical technology. And it is into these gaps that the Dendera light bulb theory inserts itself, offering a radical but visually compelling solution. The Egyptians did not need torches or oil lamps or mirrors. They had electric lights. Let us return to the crypt at Dendera and examine the reliefs in greater detail. The primary scene shows a large, elongated, bulb-shaped object emerging from what appears to be a lotus flower. The lotus was one of the most sacred symbols in ancient Egyptian religion. It represented creation, rebirth, and the emergence of the sun from the primordial waters. In Egyptian mythology, the sun god was said to have risen from a lotus flower at the moment of creation, bringing light into the world for the first time. The fact that the bulb-like object in the Dendera reliefs emerges from a lotus is, for proponents of the electrical interpretation, highly significant. If this object is indeed a source of light, then depicting it emerging from a lotus would be entirely consistent with Egyptian religious symbolism, connecting the artificial light of the bulb to the divine light of the sun and to the primordial act of creation itself. Inside the bulb-shaped object, the serpentine line extends from one end to the other. In some versions of the scene, this line appears to have a small, rounded terminus at one end, while at the other end it connects to or emerges from a small fitting at the base of the bulb. The serpentine, wavy quality of this line is one of the most debated features of the reliefs. To proponents of the electrical interpretation, it represents a filament, the thin, coiled wire inside an incandescent light bulb that glows when electrical current passes through it. The wavy, undulating form of the line is consistent with the way a heated filament might appear, glowing and shimmering inside its glass envelope. But the serpentine line has another possible identification, and this is where the conventional Egyptological interpretation enters the picture. In ancient Egyptian art and religion, the snake was an immensely powerful and multivalent symbol. Snakes represented protection, danger, fertility, rebirth, and cosmic power. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, was the symbol of royal authority, worn on the pharaoh's crown. The great serpent Apophis was the enemy of the sun god Ra, threatening to devour the solar boat as it traveled through the underworld each night, and various protective serpent deities were associated with different aspects of Egyptian religious life. Mainstream Egyptologists have consistently interpreted the serpentine line inside the Dendera bulbs not as a filament, but as a snake. Specifically, they identify it as a representation of a snake emerging from a lotus flower, a motif that has parallels elsewhere in Egyptian art and that can be connected to specific mythological narratives. The bulb-shaped enclosure around the snake is interpreted not as a glass envelope, but as some form of protective space or womb, a visual representation of the spiritual or cosmic environment in which the serpent exists. The overall scene is read as a mythological tableau depicting creation, protection, or some aspect of the Hathoric religious tradition specific to the Dendera Temple. This is the mainstream interpretation, and it is held by the vast majority of professional Egyptologists, but proponents of the electrical theory have pushed back against it with considerable vigor. They argue that the conventional interpretation, while it may be consistent with Egyptian religious symbolism in a general sense, does not adequately explain the specific visual details of the reliefs. Why is the snake enclosed in a bulb-shaped container? There are many depictions of snakes in Egyptian art, and they are almost never shown inside bulb-shaped enclosures. Why does the base of the bulb have what appears to be a socket or fitting? Why does a cable-like object extend from the base to a box on the ground? Why is a pillar or column supporting the bulb from below? These specific details, they argue, are not explained by the snake and lotus interpretation. They are, however, perfectly explained by the electrical interpretation. One of the most intriguing elements of the Dendera reliefs, and one that proponents of the electrical theory find particularly compelling, is the figure that appears beneath the bulb in several of the panels. This figure is often described as a Djed pillar, one of the most important and enigmatic symbols in all of ancient Egyptian art. The Djed pillar is typically depicted as a vertical column with 4 horizontal crossbars near the top, and it has been interpreted in various ways by different scholars. Some see it as a representation of the backbone of Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection. Others interpret it as a stylized tree or a bundle of grain stalks. Still others have connected it to the concept of stability and endurance, noting that the hieroglyphic sign Djed is associated with these qualities. In the Dendera reliefs, the Djed pillar appears to support the bulb-shaped object from below, and in some versions of the scene, the cable-like element appears to run along or through the Djed pillar before connecting to the box-like object at the base. For proponents of the electrical interpretation, the Djed pillar in this context is not a religious symbol at all. It is an insulator. It is the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the ceramic or glass insulators used in modern electrical systems to support conductors and prevent unwanted current flow. The 4 horizontal crossbars of the Djed pillar, they argue, are visually reminiscent of the ribbed structure of certain types of electrical insulators, and the pillar's function of supporting the bulb from below is entirely consistent with its interpretation as a physical support structure in an electrical lighting system. This interpretation of the Djed pillar as an insulator has been dismissed by mainstream Egyptologists as anachronistic and unfounded. The Djed pillar, they point out, appears in countless Egyptian contexts that have nothing to do with electricity or lighting. It appears on coffins, on temple walls, in papyri, in jewelry, and in a wide variety of religious and funerary scenes. It is one of the most ubiquitous symbols in Egyptian art, and its religious significance is well established. To single out its appearance in the Dendera reliefs and reinterpret it as an electrical insulator, while ignoring its thousands of other appearances in purely religious contexts, is, they argue, a fundamental misunderstanding of how Egyptian symbolic language works. but proponents of the electrical theory respond that they are not claiming the Djed pillar was always and everywhere an insulator. They are claiming that in this specific context, in the Dendera crypt, where it appears in association with what look like light bulbs and cables, it may have been depicted in a dual role, serving both its traditional religious function and representing a piece of physical technology. Egyptian art, they point out, was highly symbolic and multi-layered. A single image could simultaneously represent a religious concept, a historical event, and a physical object. The Djed pillar in the Dendera reliefs could be both the backbone of Osiris and an insulator, the religious symbolism and the technological reality reinforcing each other in a way that was perfectly natural to the Egyptian mind. The cable-like element in the Dendera reliefs is another focal point of the debate. In several of the panels, a thick, braided-looking line extends from the base of the bulb-shaped object downward and connects to a box or rectangular object sitting on the ground. Proponents of the electrical theory identify this as an electrical cable, a conductor carrying current from a power source to the light bulb. The braided appearance of the line, they argue, is consistent with the way electrical cables are constructed, with multiple strands of wire twisted together for flexibility and durability. The box-like object to which the cable connects is identified by electrical theory proponents as some form of power source, perhaps a battery or a generator. In some interpretations, it is connected to the Baghdad Battery, an archaeological artifact discovered in modern-day Iraq that some researchers believe was an ancient electrochemical cell capable of generating a small electrical current. We will discuss the Baghdad Battery in detail shortly, as it forms a crucial supporting pillar of the ancient electricity hypothesis. Mainstream Egyptologists interpret the cable-like element and the box differently. The thick line, they suggest, may represent the stem of the lotus flower from which the serpent emerges, or it may be a symbolic representation of some aspect of the mythological narrative being depicted. The box-like object is often interpreted as a base or platform, part of the architectural or ritual furniture associated with the scene. These interpretations are consistent with the way similar elements appear in other Egyptian reliefs, where stems, bases, and platforms are common features of religious scenes. But once again, the proponents of the electrical theory find the conventional interpretations insufficiently specific. A lotus stem, they argue, would not typically be depicted as a thick, braided cable. A base or platform would not typically have a cable-like attachment running from the object it supports down to itself. The specific visual details of the Dendera reliefs, they insist, point toward a technological interpretation that the conventional religious reading cannot fully accommodate. To properly evaluate the Dendera light bulb theory, we need to understand something about how ancient Egyptian art worked. Egyptian art was not naturalistic in the way that modern Western art aspires to be. It did not attempt to depict the world as it actually appeared to the eye. Instead, it operated according to a complex system of conventions, symbols, and visual codes that communicated meaning in ways that were often indirect and multi-layered. Understanding Egyptian art requires understanding these conventions, and misunderstanding them can lead to misinterpretation. One of the most fundamental conventions of Egyptian art was the principle of aspective representation, sometimes called the composite view. Under this principle, each element in a scene was depicted from the angle that made it most recognizable and most easily understood. The human body, for example, was typically shown with the head in profile, the eye from the front, the shoulders from the front, the torso at a 3/4 angle, and the legs in profile. This was not because the Egyptians did not know what a human body looked like from a single angle. It was because this composite view conveyed the most complete information about the body's form. Each part was shown from its most characteristic angle, creating a representation that was symbolically complete, even though it was not optically realistic. This principle of aspective representation extended to objects, animals, buildings, and landscapes. A garden, for example, might be depicted with a pool of water shown from above, while the trees surrounding it were shown from the side, each tree laid flat as though falling away from the pool. This was not a failure of artistic skill. It was a deliberate choice to show both the pool and the trees in their most recognizable orientations, creating a scene that communicated its content clearly even though it did not correspond to any single visual perspective. When we apply this understanding to the Dendera reliefs, the implications are significant. The images in the crypt are not photographs. They are not engineering diagrams. They are artistic representations created according to the conventions of Egyptian visual culture. This means that even if the objects depicted were actual physical objects, they would not necessarily look in the relief exactly the way they looked in real life. The artists would have depicted them according to the aspective principle, showing each element from its most characteristic and recognizable angle, and incorporating symbolic and religious elements into the representation as a matter of course. This cuts both ways in the debate over the Dendera light bulbs. On one hand, it means that we cannot simply look at the reliefs and say, that looks like a light bulb, therefore it is a light bulb, because the aspective conventions of Egyptian art mean that objects might be depicted in ways that make them look like something they are not. On the other hand, it also means that we cannot dismiss the technological interpretation simply by saying, that's not exactly what a light bulb looks like, because the aspective conventions would naturally produce a representation that was symbolically and conceptually accurate rather than photographically realistic. Now we must turn our attention to a seemingly unrelated artifact found hundreds of miles to the east, in the ancient land of Mesopotamia. This artifact is known as the Baghdad Battery, and it forms the second major pillar of the ancient electricity hypothesis. If the Dendera reliefs are the visual evidence for ancient electrical knowledge, the Baghdad Battery is presented as the physical evidence, the actual hardware that demonstrates the ancients could generate electrical current. The story of the Baghdad Battery begins in 1936, when a group of workers excavating near the village of Rabu, just outside the city of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq, discovered a collection of artifacts in a context believed to date to the Parthian period, roughly the first few centuries of the Common Era. Among the objects recovered were several curious ceramic jars, each about 5 to 6 inches tall, with a narrow neck and a wide body. Inside each jar was a copper cylinder, open at the top and sealed at the bottom with a copper disc. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod, suspended from the top by an asphalt plug that also served to seal the mouth of the jar. The iron rod hung down inside the copper cylinder without touching it, separated from the copper by a small gap. The artifacts were brought to the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, where they were examined by Wilhelm Koenig, a German archaeologist who was serving as the director of the museum's laboratory. Koenig studied the objects and was struck by their unusual construction. The arrangement of materials, a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod sealed in a ceramic vessel, bore a remarkable resemblance to a simple electrochemical cell, the basic building block of a battery. If the jar had been filled with an acidic solution, such as vinegar or citric acid from lemon juice, a chemical reaction between the copper and the iron would have generated a small electrical voltage, just as in a modern battery. Koenig published his observations in a paper in 1940, proposing that the Baghdad jars were indeed ancient batteries, used to generate electrical current for some unknown purpose. His suggestion was met with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. The idea that ancient people had discovered the principles of electrochemistry was startling, but the physical evidence was suggestive, and Koenig's reasoning was not unreasonable. In the decades following Koenig's initial publication, several researchers attempted to test his hypothesis by constructing replicas of the Baghdad jars and filling them with various acidic solutions. The results were intriguing. When filled with vinegar, a replica Baghdad battery produced approximately 1.5 to 2 volts of electrical potential, comparable to a modern AA battery. When grape juice was used as the electrolyte, similar voltages were achieved. The experiment demonstrated conclusively that the Baghdad jars could function as batteries if they were filled with an acidic liquid. This finding energized the ancient electricity hypothesis enormously. Here was proof, proponents argued, that ancient people not only could have generated electricity, but had actually built the devices to do it. If the Baghdad Battery could produce 2 volts, then a series of batteries connected together could produce higher voltages, potentially enough to power a simple electric light. And if the people of Mesopotamia had this technology, could they not have shared it with their neighbors in Egypt? The ancient Near East was a connected world. Trade routes linked Egypt with Mesopotamia, the Levant, and beyond. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed between these civilizations for thousands of years. If electrochemical cells existed in Mesopotamia, there was no reason they could not have made their way to Egypt. But we need to examine the Baghdad Battery more carefully, because the story is more complicated than the simple narrative suggests. First, there is the question of dating. The artifacts were originally assigned to the Parthian period, roughly the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century CE, but subsequent analysis has raised questions about this dating. Some researchers have argued that the jars may date to the Sassanid period, which followed the Parthian period and lasted from the 3rd to the 7th century CE. Others have questioned whether the dating can be established with any certainty at all, given the circumstances of the original excavation and the limited documentation that accompanied it. The jars were not found in a well-documented archaeological context with clear stratigraphic relationships that would allow precise dating. They were found during construction work, and their exact find spot and associated materials are not well recorded. Second, there is the question of function. Even if the Baghdad jars could function as batteries, that does not mean they were intended to function as batteries. Many objects can produce unintended effects. A copper pipe buried in acidic soil will generate a small electrical potential, but that does not mean it was designed as a battery. The question is whether the specific arrangement of materials in the Baghdad jars, copper cylinder, iron rod, asphalt seal, was deliberately designed to generate electrical current, or whether these materials were assembled for some entirely different purpose and the electrical potential was a coincidental byproduct. Several alternative explanations for the Baghdad jars have been proposed. One of the most widely cited is that they were used for the storage of sacred scrolls or documents. In the ancient Near East, important documents were sometimes stored in sealed ceramic vessels to protect them from moisture and insects. The copper cylinder might have served as an additional protective layer, and the iron rod might have served as a handle or a support for a rolled document. The asphalt seal would have provided an airtight closure. Another explanation is that the jars were used for electroplating, the process of depositing a thin layer of one metal onto the surface of another using an electrical current. This explanation is actually compatible with the battery hypothesis, since it accepts that the jars generated electricity but proposes a specific practical use for that electricity rather than lighting. Some researchers have pointed to examples of ancient metal objects that appear to have been plated with gold or silver, suggesting that electroplating may have been practiced in the ancient world. However, the evidence for ancient electroplating is contested, and many of the objects cited as examples can be explained by other metalworking techniques, such as fire gilding or mercury amalgam plating, that do not require electricity. A third explanation is that the jars were simply storage vessels for something mundane, perhaps wine or oil, and that the copper and iron components served some practical function related to storage, such as flavoring, preservation, or measurement. This explanation does not account well for the specific arrangement of the components, but it has the virtue of not requiring any assumptions about ancient technological knowledge. The truth is that we do not know with certainty what the Baghdad jars were used for. The battery hypothesis is plausible but unproven. The alternative explanations are also plausible but unproven. The artifacts themselves have been through a tumultuous history, They were looted from the National Museum of Iraq during the chaos of recent conflicts, and their current whereabouts and condition are uncertain. This means that further scientific analysis may be difficult or impossible. For the proponents of the ancient electricity theory, the Baghdad Battery and the Dendera reliefs form a complementary pair of evidence. The reliefs show what the technology looked like. The battery shows that the basic principle was understood and implemented. Together, they paint a picture of an ancient world in which electricity was not unknown, but was a practical technology used for specific purposes, including the illumination of sacred spaces. But the connection between the Baghdad Battery and the Dendera reliefs is not straightforward. The Baghdad Battery, whatever its date, comes from Mesopotamia, not Egypt. It was found in Iraq, not in the Nile Valley. There are no Baghdad-style batteries that have been found in Egyptian archaeological contexts. The two pieces of evidence are separated by hundreds of miles and potentially by centuries or even millennia. To connect them requires a theory of technological transfer, a hypothesis that knowledge of electrochemistry developed in one region of the ancient Near East was transmitted to another region and adapted for different purposes. Such transfers of technology certainly occurred in the ancient world. Metallurgical techniques, agricultural innovations, writing systems, and architectural methods all spread between civilizations through trade, conquest, migration, and cultural contact. The ancient Egyptians adopted and adapted numerous technologies from their neighbors, including the horse-drawn chariot from the Hyksos, glass-making techniques possibly from the Levant, and iron-working technology from multiple sources. So the idea that electrochemical knowledge could have traveled from Mesopotamia to Egypt is not inherently implausible, but it requires evidence, and that evidence has not been found. There are no Egyptian texts that describe batteries or electrical generation. There are no Egyptian artifacts that can be identified as components of an electrical system. The only evidence proponents would argue is the Dendera reliefs themselves, which brings us full circle. Let us now consider another aspect of the ancient electricity hypothesis that is less frequently discussed but equally important. If the ancient Egyptians had electric lighting, what did they use it for, and why did the knowledge disappear? The proponents of the theory generally argue that electric lighting was used in the interior spaces of temples and tombs, precisely those environments where the absence of soot has been noted as problematic. Electric lights produce no soot, no smoke, no combustion byproducts. They produce clean, steady illumination that would be ideal for the detailed painting and carving work that Egyptian artisans performed in enclosed underground spaces. If the Egyptians had electric lights, the clean ceilings of the tombs would be explained. The absence of soot would not be mysterious. The practical problem of illuminating deep underground spaces would have a practical solution. Some proponents go further and argue that electric lighting may have been a closely guarded secret of the Egyptian priesthood. The temple crypts at Dendera, where the light bulb reliefs are found, were hidden, restricted spaces accessible only to the highest-ranking priests. The knowledge of how to construct and operate the lighting system may have been among the most sacred mysteries of the temple, revealed only to initiates and never committed to writing in any text that has survived. The reliefs themselves, in this interpretation, are not public displays of technology. They are sacred images, hidden in the most secret part of the temple, depicting one of the temple's most sacred possessions. This argument for priestly secrecy is used to explain why no other evidence of ancient Egyptian electricity has been found. The technology was known only to a small elite. It was not widely distributed. When the traditional Egyptian priesthood declined and eventually disappeared, first under Greek and Roman influence and later with the coming of Christianity and Islam, the knowledge was lost. The priests who understood the technology died without passing on their secrets. The equipment was destroyed, repurposed, or simply decayed, and the only trace that remained was the images on the walls of the hidden crypt at Dendera, waiting silently in the darkness for 2,000 years until modern explorers rediscovered them. This is a compelling narrative, and it has the advantage of explaining the absence of corroborating evidence, a common challenge for alternative history theories. but it also has significant weaknesses. The argument from priestly secrecy is unfalsifiable, meaning it cannot be tested or disproven. If there is no evidence because the knowledge was secret, then the absence of evidence cannot count against the theory, but it also cannot count in its favor. We are left with the Dendera reliefs and the Baghdad Battery, and we must evaluate the ancient electricity hypothesis on the strength of that evidence alone. There is another dimension to this debate that deserves careful attention, and that is the question of what else the Dendera reliefs might tell us if we look beyond the most famous panels. The crypt containing the light bulb images also contains extensive hieroglyphic inscriptions that describe the objects and scenes depicted on the walls. These inscriptions have been studied by Egyptologists who read ancient Egyptian fluently, and they provide significant context for the images. According to the scholars who have translated these inscriptions, the texts describe the objects in religious and mythological terms. The serpent inside the bulb-shaped enclosure is identified in the inscriptions as a form of Harsamtis, a divine serpent associated with the Dendera Temple. Harsamtis, whose name means Horus, uniter of the two lands, was a form of the god Horus particularly venerated at Dendera. He was depicted as a serpent emerging from a lotus flower, a visual motif that represents the emergence of the divine from the primordial waters of creation. The bulb-shaped enclosure, according to the inscriptions, represents the womb or egg from which the serpent god emerges, a cosmic space of creation and renewal. The Djed pillar in the scenes is identified in the inscriptions with its traditional religious significance, as a symbol of stability and endurance associated with Osiris. The cable-like element is described as part of the mythological apparatus of the scene. The box-like object at the base is interpreted as a base or shrine. In short, the inscriptions describe a religious scene, not a technological one. They speak of gods and creation, not of electricity and illumination. Proponents of the electrical theory have responded to this in several ways. Some argue that the inscriptions are a form of coded language, using religious terminology to describe technological concepts that the priests did not want to reveal openly. The serpent god emerging from the lotus womb could be a metaphorical description of the glowing filament activating inside the glass bulb. The Djed pillar of stability could be the insulator that supports the lighting apparatus. The sacred cable could be the power conductor. In this reading, the religious language and the technological reality are not contradictory but complementary, two ways of describing the same phenomenon, one spiritual and one physical. Other proponents argue that the inscriptions may have been added later, or may represent a later reinterpretation of originally technological images. As the knowledge of the lighting technology was lost, later priests who no longer understood what the images depicted may have provided religious explanations that made sense within their own framework of understanding. The images remained, but their original meaning was forgotten and replaced with a mythological interpretation. These arguments are creative, but they face a fundamental challenge. They require us to dismiss or reinterpret the most direct evidence we have about what the images mean, the inscriptions that accompany them, in favor of an interpretation based on visual resemblance alone. This is a significant methodological step, and it raises important questions about how we evaluate evidence from the ancient world. Let us take a step back and consider the broader context of ancient Egyptian technology. The Egyptians were, by any measure, extraordinary engineers and craftspeople. They built the Great Pyramids of Giza, structures so massive and so precisely constructed that they continue to inspire awe and wonder 4,500 years after their creation. They carved enormous temples out of solid rock, erected colossal statues, constructed vast irrigation systems, developed sophisticated techniques for mummification, created exquisite jewelry and artwork, and managed a complex civilization that endured for over 3,000 years. Their technological achievements were remarkable, and there is much about their methods that we still do not fully understand. But the technologies we can document through archaeological evidence, through ancient texts, through experimental archaeology, are all consistent with the capabilities of a sophisticated Bronze Age and Iron Age civilization. The Egyptians used copper and bronze tools, later supplemented with iron. They used simple machines, levers, ramps, rollers, and sledges. They understood basic principles of mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. They were skilled in the working of stone, wood, leather, textiles, glass, and precious metals. Their medicine was sophisticated for its time, incorporating both practical treatments and religious rituals. Their agricultural technology, centered on the annual flooding of the Nile, supported a large and prosperous population. What we do not find in the Egyptian archaeological and textual record is any evidence of the fundamental scientific knowledge that would be required for electrical technology. There is no evidence that the Egyptians understood the nature of electricity, the principles of electromagnetism, or the relationship between electrical current and light. There are no Egyptian texts discussing electrical phenomena, no words in the Egyptian language for concepts like voltage, current, resistance, or conductivity. There are no artifacts other than the disputed Dendera reliefs that can be interpreted as electrical components. There are no workshops or manufacturing sites that show evidence of electrical equipment production. There is no evidence of the mining or refining of materials that would be needed for electrical technology, such as tungsten for filaments or refined copper for wiring, beyond what was needed for their well-documented conventional uses. This absence of evidence is not absolute proof that the technology did not exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the old axiom goes. But it is significant. The ancient Egyptians were prolific record keepers. They inscribed their achievements, their knowledge, and their daily activities on temple walls, tomb walls, papyri, ostraca, and numerous other surfaces. They left behind an enormous body of textual and visual material that tells us a great deal about their world. For a technology as significant as electric lighting to have left no trace in this vast corpus, other than a few cryptic reliefs in a hidden chamber, would be extraordinary. Not impossible, but extraordinary. The question of how ancient Egyptians lit their underground workspaces remains genuinely interesting, even if the electrical hypothesis is set aside. Let us examine more carefully what we actually know about ancient Egyptian lighting technology based on archaeological and textual evidence. Oil lamps are by far the most common lighting technology attested in ancient Egypt. Thousands of oil lamps have been found at archaeological sites throughout the country, ranging from simple stone or ceramic dishes to more elaborate manufactured vessels with handles, spouts, and decorative elements. The most basic Egyptian oil lamp was simply a shallow dish filled with oil, with a wick made of twisted linen or another fiber placed in the oil with one end extending over the rim. The oil was drawn up the wick by capillary action and burned at the exposed end, producing a small but steady flame. The oils used in Egyptian lamps varied. Castor oil, which was produced in large quantities in ancient Egypt, was commonly used. Olive oil, sesame oil, and animal fats were also used. The choice of fuel affected the quality of the light and the amount of smoke produced. Castor oil, for example, burns relatively cleanly compared to animal fat, producing less soot and a steadier flame. Experiments with replicas of ancient Egyptian lamps using castor oil have shown that they can produce adequate illumination for close work in an enclosed space, though the light is dim by modern standards. An interesting piece of evidence comes from ancient Egyptian texts that specifically mention the use of lamps in temples and tombs. The pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead all contain references to light and illumination in religious contexts, but these references are typically to divine or symbolic light rather than to practical lighting technology. There are, however, administrative texts that record the distribution of oil for use in temple lamps, confirming that oil lamps were a standard feature of temple operations. One particularly relevant text is a list from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, the community of artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE. These texts record the distribution of wicks and oil to workers for use in the tombs, providing direct evidence that oil lamps were used to illuminate the underground workspaces where the tomb decorations were created. The texts also record the return of unused wicks, a detail that tells us the authorities kept careful track of these supplies, presumably because they were valuable. This evidence from Deir el-Medina is significant because it directly addresses the question of how the tombs were illuminated. The workers themselves used oil lamps. This is not speculation or inference. It is documented in their own records. The lights they used were simple oil lamps fueled by oil distributed from temple and state supplies with wicks that were tracked and accounted for. But what about the soot? If the workers used oil lamps, why are the tomb ceilings so clean? Several explanations have been proposed, and they are worth considering in detail. First, as mentioned earlier, the type of oil used matters. Castor oil, linseed oil, and other refined vegetable oils burn much more cleanly than animal fat or crude oils. If the Egyptians used high-quality oil in their tomb lamps, the soot production would have been significantly reduced, though not eliminated entirely. Second, the type of lamp matters. Experiments have shown that covered lamps, which restrict airflow to the flame, produce less soot than open-dish lamps because the more controlled combustion results in more complete burning of the fuel. Some ancient Egyptian lamps appear to have been designed with this principle in mind, with partially enclosed flames that would have reduced smoke production. Third, modern researchers have pointed out that many of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings have been open and accessible for centuries, exposed to wind, water infiltration, and the passage of countless visitors. Natural weathering processes may have removed some or all of the soot that accumulated during the original use of the tombs. Mineral deposits from water seepage may have covered soot layers. And modern conservation efforts, including cleaning and restoration, may have removed evidence of ancient soot. Fourth, some researchers have suggested that the Egyptians may have used a technique involving salt. Adding salt to the oil in a lamp can significantly reduce soot production because the sodium in the salt reacts with carbon particles in the flame, converting them into sodium carbonate rather than allowing them to escape as soot. If the Egyptians discovered this technique empirically, by noticing that salted oil burned more cleanly, they could have produced remarkably clean burning lamps that would leave minimal residue on the tomb ceilings. Fifth, there is the possibility that at least some of the illumination in the tombs came from reflected sunlight. While the chain of mirrors theory faces significant practical challenges for deep tombs with winding corridors, some of the shallower tombs and temple chambers might have been partially illuminated by sunlight reflected from a single well-placed mirror or polished surface. This would have supplemented the light from oil lamps, reducing the number of lamps needed, and therefore reducing the total amount of soot produced. Each of these explanations addresses part of the puzzle, and in combination, they may account for the relatively clean condition of the tomb ceilings. They do not require the invocation of electric lighting or any technology unknown to the conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities, but they also do not completely resolve the question. The issue of tomb illumination remains an area where our understanding is incomplete, and it is legitimate to acknowledge that incompleteness while continuing to investigate. Let us now explore a fascinating aspect of the ancient electricity debate that is often overlooked in popular discussions. This is the question of what we actually know about the history of electricity and when the fundamental principles were first understood. The story that most people learn in school is that electricity was discovered in the 18th and 19th centuries through the work of scientists like Benjamin Franklin, Luigi Galvani, Alessandro Volta, Michael Faraday, and Thomas Edison. Franklin's famous kite experiment demonstrated the electrical nature of lightning. Galvani's observations of frog legs twitching in the presence of electrical current led to the concept of animal electricity. Volta's invention of the voltaic pile, the first true battery, provided a reliable source of electrical current. Faraday's work on electromagnetism laid the foundations for the electric motor and the generator, and Edison's development of a practical incandescent light bulb in 1879 brought electric lighting into the modern world. This narrative is essentially correct, but it glosses over an important fact. Electrical phenomena were observed and discussed long before the 18th century. The ancient Greeks knew that rubbing amber with fur produced a static charge that could attract small objects. The Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus, writing around 600 BCE, described this phenomenon, and the Greek word for amber, electron, is the root from which our word electricity is derived. The ancient Romans were familiar with the electric shocks produced by torpedo rays, a type of electric fish found in the Mediterranean, and Roman physicians reportedly used these fish to treat headaches and gout, placing the fish on the patient's body to deliver therapeutic shocks. These observations demonstrate that ancient people were aware of electrical phenomena, even if they did not understand the underlying science. Static electricity, bioelectricity, and the attractive properties of charged objects were all known in antiquity. The question is whether this observational awareness ever crossed the threshold into practical technological application, whether anyone in the ancient world moved from noticing that amber attracted straw to building a device that could generate useful electrical current. The Baghdad Battery, if it is indeed a battery, would represent exactly this threshold crossing. It would show that at least one ancient civilization moved beyond passive observation of electrical phenomena to active generation of electrical current. But even if we accept the Baghdad Battery as a genuine electrochemical cell, the gap between producing 2 volts of current from a small jar of vinegar and producing enough power to illuminate a light bulb is enormous. A single Baghdad battery could perhaps produce enough current to tingle the skin or to deposit a microscopic layer of metal in an electroplating process. But lighting even a small incandescent bulb requires far more power, and the engineering challenges of producing a functional filament, a vacuum or inert gas envelope, and a reliable power source are formidable. Modern incandescent light bulbs work by passing electrical current through a thin filament, typically made of tungsten, which has an extremely high melting point. The current heats the filament to a temperature of about 2500 degrees Celsius, causing it to glow brightly. To prevent the filament from burning up, it is enclosed in a glass bulb from which the air has been evacuated or which has been filled with an inert gas like argon. The development of a practical incandescent light required solving multiple interrelated engineering problems simultaneously. Finding a material for the filament that would glow brightly without melting, developing the technology to create a vacuum or to manufacture inert gas, designing a glass envelope that could withstand the heat, and building a power source capable of delivering the necessary current. Edison and his competitors in the 1870s and 1880s struggled with all of these challenges. Edison tested thousands of different materials for his filament before settling on carbonized bamboo fiber and later on tungsten. He developed improved vacuum pumps to evacuate his glass bulbs. He designed generators and distribution systems to deliver power to his lamps. The development of practical electric lighting was one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century, requiring extensive knowledge of physics, chemistry, materials science, and manufacturing processes. Could the ancient Egyptians have solved all of these problems? Could they have developed a filament material that worked? Could they have created a vacuum inside a glass envelope? Could they have built a power source capable of delivering enough current? Each of these questions poses significant challenges for the ancient electricity hypothesis. Glass technology in ancient Egypt is well documented and impressive, but it had significant limitations. The Egyptians began producing glass around 1500 BCE during the New Kingdom period, and they achieved remarkable skill in creating glass vessels, beads, inlays, and other objects. But their glass was produced at relatively low temperatures and was often opaque or translucent rather than fully transparent. The production of large, thin-walled, transparent glass vessels of the kind that would be needed for a light bulb envelope was beyond the capabilities of ancient Egyptian glassmakers, as far as we can determine from the archaeological evidence. Blown glass, which allowed the production of thin-walled transparent vessels, was not developed until the 1st century BCE in the Roman period, and even then the glass produced was far cruder than what would be needed for a functional light bulb. Vacuum technology is even more problematic. The concept of a vacuum was not understood in the ancient world. Aristotle famously declared that nature abhors a vacuum, and this view prevailed in Western science until the 17th century, when experiments by Evangelista Torricelli, Blaise Pascal, and Otto von Guericke demonstrated that vacuums could be created. The development of effective vacuum pumps was a slow process that continued through the 18th and 19th centuries. Edison's vacuum pumps were among the most advanced of their time, and even they could not achieve a perfect vacuum. The idea that the ancient Egyptians could have created a vacuum inside a glass vessel, a feat that required centuries of scientific development in the modern world, is extremely difficult to support. Filament technology poses similar challenges. What material would the ancient Egyptians have used as a filament? Modern incandescent bulbs use tungsten, a metal that was not known in the ancient world, and that requires extremely high temperatures to extract from its ore. Edison's early filaments used carbonized organic materials, primarily plant fibers that had been baked at high temperatures to convert them to carbon. Carbon has a lower melting point than tungsten and is less efficient as a filament, but it can produce light when heated by an electrical current. Could the Egyptians have produced carbonized fibers suitable for use as filaments? Possibly, since charcoal production was well known in the ancient world. But a carbonized fiber filament requires a vacuum or inert gas environment to function, bringing us back to the vacuum problem. And then there is the power source. Even if we accept the Baghdad Battery as a genuine electrochemical cell, a single cell producing 1.5 to 2 volts is not nearly enough to illuminate an incandescent filament. Edison's early bulbs required about 100 volts. To achieve this from Baghdad-style batteries, you would need to connect 50 or more batteries in series, each one charged with fresh acidic solution, maintained and monitored to ensure consistent current output. This would require a sophisticated understanding of series circuits, voltage addition, and current management, concepts that have no attested basis in ancient knowledge. Some proponents of the ancient electricity theory have suggested that the Egyptians might have used a different type of lighting technology than incandescence. Arc lamps, for example, produce light by creating an electrical arc between 2 carbon electrodes, and they can operate at lower voltages than incandescent bulbs. Arc lighting was the first form of electric lighting developed in the modern era, preceding Edison's incandescent bulb by several decades. Could the ancient Egyptians have used arc lamps? The visual evidence from the Dendera reliefs does not particularly support this interpretation, since the images show what appears to be a single glowing element inside an enclosed space, not the open arc between 2 electrodes that characterizes an arc lamp. But it is worth considering as a theoretical possibility. Other proponents have suggested even more exotic possibilities. Some have proposed that the ancient Egyptians might have used Jaissler tubes, glass tubes filled with low-pressure gas that glow when an electrical current is passed through them. Jaissler tubes were developed in the mid-19th century and were precursors to neon signs and fluorescent lights. They can operate at relatively low voltages and produce a soft, diffused glow. The elongated tubular shape of the Dendera bulbs could be consistent with Jaissler tubes, and the serpentine line inside could represent the glowing gas discharge rather than a solid filament. This interpretation has some visual appeal, but it faces the same fundamental challenges regarding vacuum technology and power supply that plague all versions of the ancient electricity hypothesis. There is yet another aspect of the ancient Egyptian world that deserves consideration in this discussion, and that is the role of secrecy and esoteric knowledge in Egyptian religious life. The ancient Egyptian priesthood was not a casual or open institution. It was a highly structured hierarchy with multiple levels of initiation, each level granting access to more sacred knowledge and more restricted spaces within the temple. The innermost sanctuaries of Egyptian temples were accessible only to the highest-ranking priests and to the pharaoh himself. The rituals performed in these spaces were secret, and the knowledge required to perform them was transmitted orally from master to initiate, not written down in publicly accessible texts. This culture of secrecy has left significant gaps in our understanding of Egyptian religious practice. We know the outlines of many Egyptian rituals from the texts and reliefs on temple walls, but the most sacred and secret aspects of these rituals may never have been recorded, or may have been recorded in ways that we cannot fully understand. The mystery traditions of ancient Egypt were famous throughout the ancient world. Greek philosophers and historians, including Herodotus, Plato, and Plutarch, wrote about the secret wisdom of the Egyptian priests, and many Greek thinkers traveled to Egypt specifically to learn from them. The Greek mystery religions, including the Eleusinian mysteries and the Hermetic tradition, were heavily influenced by Egyptian religious ideas and practices. This culture of secrecy is relevant to the ancient electricity debate because it provides a plausible mechanism for the concealment and eventual loss of technological knowledge. If the technology of electric lighting was known only to a small, secretive priestly elite, if it was considered a sacred mystery rather than a practical technology, then its absence from the broader archaeological and textual record would not be surprising. Sacred mysteries were, by definition, things that were not written down or spoken of openly. They were transmitted through direct experience and oral teaching, and when the chain of transmission was broken, the knowledge was lost. This argument has been made by numerous proponents of the ancient electricity theory, and it is not without a certain logic. But it is important to recognize that it is also an argument that can be used to support almost any claim about ancient knowledge. If we accept that any technology could have existed but been concealed by a secretive priesthood, then there is no limit to what we might attribute to the ancient Egyptians: nuclear power, computers, aircraft, anything at all, because the absence of evidence can always be explained by the culture of secrecy. This is why mainstream scholars are wary of such arguments. They are not disprovable, and non-disprovable claims are outside the bounds of scientific inquiry. Let us return once more to the Dendera Temple and consider some additional evidence that bears on the debate. The reliefs in the crypt are not the only unusual images in the Dendera complex. The temple is rich in astronomical and cosmological imagery, including the famous Dendera zodiac and numerous scenes depicting the movements of the stars, the phases of the moon, and the cycles of the Nile flood. The Egyptians at Dendera were deeply engaged with observing and recording the patterns of the natural world, and their temple was, among other things, an observatory and a repository of astronomical knowledge. Some researchers have noted that certain elements in the crypt reliefs may have astronomical rather than technological significance. The serpent inside the bulb, for example, might represent a celestial serpent, a constellation, or a celestial body depicted in the act of traversing the sky. The bulb-shaped enclosure might represent the horizon, the dome of the sky, or the vessel of the sun god's boat. The Djed pillar might represent the axis of the world, the pillar that supports the sky. In this reading, the crypt reliefs are not about electricity at all. They are about cosmology, depicting the movements of celestial bodies and the structure of the cosmos in the symbolic language of Egyptian art. This cosmological interpretation has some attractive features. It connects the crypt reliefs to the broader astronomical themes of the Dendera Temple. It is consistent with the inscriptions that accompany the images, and it accounts for the specific visual details of the reliefs without requiring any assumptions about ancient technology. But like all interpretations of ambiguous ancient imagery, it is not definitive. The reliefs remain open to multiple readings, and no single interpretation has achieved universal acceptance. One of the most interesting experiments ever conducted in connection with the Dendera light bulb theory took place in the early 2000s, when a group of researchers and engineers attempted to build a working model of the Dendera light based on the reliefs. Using the images as a guide, they constructed a large glass tube, placed a vacuum inside it, and introduced a serpentine electrode. When they applied electrical current to the apparatus, the gas inside the tube glowed, producing visible light. This experiment was widely publicized in alternative history circles as proof that the Dendera reliefs depicted functional technology, and the experiment did demonstrate that the visual form depicted in the reliefs could, in principle, function as a light-producing device. But critics pointed out several important caveats. The experiment used modern materials, modern vacuum technology, and a modern power source. The glass was manufactured with modern techniques. The vacuum was created with a modern pump. The electrical current was supplied by a modern generator. The experiment showed that modern engineers could build a device that looked like the Dendera images, not that ancient Egyptians could have done the same. Furthermore, critics noted that the experimenters had made specific design choices based on their interpretation of the reliefs, choices that were not necessarily the only possible interpretations. The serpentine filament could have been interpreted differently, leading to a different design. The glass envelope could have been given a different shape or size. The experiment demonstrated the plausibility of one specific interpretation, but not its correctness. Nevertheless, the experiment remains a fascinating exercise in experimental archaeology, or perhaps experimental alternative archaeology. It showed that the visual similarity between the Dendera reliefs and modern lighting technology is not merely superficial. The forms depicted in the reliefs can, in fact, function as lighting devices if constructed with appropriate materials and powered by an electrical source. This does not prove that the ancient Egyptians built such devices, but it does suggest that the resemblance is more than coincidental. As we approach the midpoint of our exploration, it is worth pausing to consider what is really at stake in this debate. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians had electric lighting is not just a question about one specific technology. It is a question about how we understand the capabilities of ancient civilizations, about the nature of technological progress, and about the relationship between the ancient and modern worlds. The conventional view of technological history is broadly linear. Humanity progressed from simple stone tools to more complex technologies over thousands of years, moving through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and eventually into the modern Industrial Age. Each advance built on previous ones, and the general trend was toward greater complexity, greater capability, and greater understanding of the natural world. In this view, the ancient Egyptians were remarkable for their time, but their technological capabilities were fundamentally limited to what was achievable with the materials and knowledge available in the Bronze and Iron Ages. Electric lighting was a product of the 19th century, building on centuries of scientific research into the nature of electricity, and it could not have existed in antiquity because the prerequisite knowledge and materials did not exist. The alternative view, championed by proponents of the ancient electricity theory and by the broader alternative history movement, challenges this linear narrative. It proposes that technological progress has not been smooth and continuous, but has been marked by peaks and valleys, periods of advancement followed by periods of decline and loss. In this view, it is entirely possible for an ancient civilization to have achieved a level of technological sophistication that was subsequently lost, not because the technology was imaginary, but because the social, political, or environmental conditions that supported it collapsed. Knowledge can be lost, technologies can be forgotten. Skills that took centuries to develop can disappear in a single generation if the practitioners die without passing on their expertise. This idea of cyclical technological progress, of lost knowledge and forgotten achievements, has deep roots in human thought. The ancient Greeks themselves believed that they lived in an age of decline, that earlier ages had been greater and more glorious than their own. The concept of a golden age followed by successive ages of decline is found in Greek, Roman, Hindu, and many other mythological traditions, and there are real historical examples of technological loss. The Romans developed a recipe for concrete that was not rediscovered until the modern era. Greek fire, the Byzantine incendiary weapon, was so secret that its composition was lost when the Byzantine Empire fell. The techniques used to build the Great Pyramid of Giza are still debated, precisely because the knowledge of how they were built was not preserved. These examples demonstrate that technological loss is real and has occurred throughout history. But they also illustrate an important distinction. In each of these cases, the lost technology is known to have existed because there is extensive evidence for it. Roman concrete survives in buildings that still stand. Greek fire is described in numerous historical texts. The Great Pyramid exists as physical proof of whatever technology built it. In the case of ancient Egyptian electricity, the only evidence is the Dendera reliefs and the disputed Baghdad Battery. There are no surviving devices, no textual descriptions, no physical traces of electrical infrastructure, no evidence of the materials or manufacturing processes that would have been required. The evidence is at best suggestive and at worst a case of seeing what we want to see in ambiguous ancient imagery. There is a psychological phenomenon known as pareidolia that is relevant to this discussion. Pareidolia is the tendency of the human brain to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous stimuli. It is the reason we see faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, and the man in the moon. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, evolved to find meaning and significance in the world around us, and they are so good at this task that they often find patterns where none exist. Pareidolia can operate in the interpretation of ancient art. When we look at the Dendera reliefs, we bring with us the visual vocabulary of our own technological civilization. We know what light bulbs look like, what filaments look like, what electrical cables look like. When we see forms in the ancient reliefs that resemble these modern objects, our brains automatically make the connection, and the resemblance can seem so striking that it is difficult to believe it is coincidental. But the ancient Egyptians did not share our visual vocabulary. They had never seen a light bulb, never held an electrical cable, never seen a filament glow inside a glass envelope. When they carved these reliefs, they were working within their own visual and symbolic system, a system in which serpents, lotuses, Djed pillars, and divine figures had specific and well-established meanings. The forms they created were designed to communicate within that system, not within ours. This does not necessarily mean that the resemblance is entirely coincidental. It is possible, though unlikely in the conventional view, that the ancients depicted a technology that we happen to recognize. But it does mean that we should be cautious about interpreting ancient images through the lens of modern technology. What looks like a light bulb to us may have been something entirely different to the people who created it. The debate over the Dendera light bulbs also raises important questions about the methodology of studying the ancient world. How do we decide what ancient images mean? What kind of evidence counts, and how much evidence do we need before we can draw a conclusion? In mainstream Egyptology, the interpretation of ancient images relies on several interlocking lines of evidence. First, there are the texts, the hieroglyphic inscriptions that often accompany the images and provide explicit descriptions of what is depicted. Second, there is comparative evidence, the thousands of other Egyptian images and texts that provide a context for understanding any individual scene. Third, there is archaeological evidence, the physical remains of the culture that produced the images, including tools, materials, and structures. Fourth, there is ethnographic evidence, observations of living cultures that may preserve practices or beliefs descended from ancient traditions. When all of these lines of evidence converge on a single interpretation, that interpretation is considered strong. When they diverge, or when some lines of evidence are absent, the interpretation is weaker and more uncertain. In the case of the Dendera reliefs, the textual evidence, the inscriptions, supports a religious interpretation. The comparative evidence, other Egyptian images of serpents and lotuses, also supports a religious interpretation. The archaeological evidence, no electrical artifacts found in Egypt, does not support a technological interpretation. Only the visual resemblance to modern technology supports the electrical interpretation, and this is a single line of evidence that must be weighed against the others. Proponents of the electrical theory argue that mainstream Egyptology is too rigid in its methodology, too committed to its existing framework, and too quick to dismiss evidence that does not fit. They argue that the visual evidence should be given more weight, and that the textual and comparative evidence can be reinterpreted to accommodate the technological reading. Critics respond that this approach cherry-picks evidence, accepting what supports the desired conclusion and reinterpreting or dismissing what does not. This methodological debate is important because it goes beyond the specific question of the Dendera reliefs. It touches on fundamental questions about how we study the past, how we evaluate evidence, and how we balance open-mindedness with rigor. These are questions that do not have easy answers, and they are worth taking seriously regardless of where one stands on the ancient electricity question. There is one more piece of evidence that proponents of the ancient electricity theory often cite, and it is worth discussing before we conclude this first part of our exploration. This is the Abydos helicopter, a set of hieroglyphs found in the Temple of Seti at Abydos that some observers have interpreted as depicting modern vehicles, including a helicopter, a submarine, a tank, and an airplane. The Abydos hieroglyphs are relevant to the Dendera discussion because they represent a similar type of evidence, ancient images that appear to depict modern technology. Like the Dendera reliefs, the Abydos hieroglyphs have been enthusiastically embraced by alternative history proponents and firmly rejected by mainstream Egyptologists. And like the Dendera reliefs, they illustrate the challenges of interpreting ancient visual material through modern eyes. The mainstream explanation for the Abydos hieroglyphs is well established and widely accepted among scholars. The images are the result of palimpsest, the practice of carving new inscriptions over old ones. In the Temple of Seti, a later pharaoh, probably Ramesses II, had his own names and titles carved over the original inscriptions of Seti over time. The plaster filling that covered the original inscriptions eroded, revealing parts of both sets of inscriptions simultaneously. The overlapping hieroglyphs, viewed together, created shapes that coincidentally resemble modern vehicles. The helicopter, for example, is formed by the partial overlap of hieroglyphs from Seti's original inscription and Ramesses' replacement inscription. When each set of hieroglyphs is read separately, they produce standard royal titles and epithets that have nothing to do with technology. This explanation is supported by detailed epigraphic analysis and is consistent with the well-documented practice of Egyptian pharaohs reinscribing the monuments of their predecessors. But proponents of the alternative theory reject this explanation, arguing that the resemblance to modern vehicles is too precise to be coincidental, and that the palimpsest explanation is a convenient excuse to dismiss inconvenient evidence. The Abydos hieroglyphs and the Dendera reliefs are often cited together as part of a broader pattern of evidence for advanced ancient technology. Individually, each can perhaps be explained away by conventional means. But taken together, proponents argue they form a cumulative case that is difficult to dismiss. The more instances of ancient images resembling modern technology we find, the harder it becomes to attribute all of them to coincidence, misinterpretation, or pareidolia. This cumulative argument has some rhetorical force, but it also has a logical weakness. If each individual piece of evidence has a plausible conventional explanation, then combining multiple pieces of individually weak evidence does not necessarily produce a strong case. A chain of weak evidence can be just as fragile as a single weak link. Unless the individual pieces of evidence are genuinely independent and genuinely inexplicable by conventional means, combining them does not significantly strengthen the overall argument. As we draw the first part of our exploration to a close, let us take stock of where we stand. We have examined the Dendera Temple complex and the extraordinary reliefs found in its hidden crypts. We have seen how these reliefs depict objects that bear a striking visual resemblance to electric light bulbs, complete with what appear to be filaments, cables, and power sources. We have explored the Baghdad Battery and the evidence that ancient people may have understood basic electrochemistry. We have considered the genuine mystery of how the ancient Egyptians illuminated their underground workspaces and the persistent question of the missing soot. We have examined the conventional Egyptological interpretation of the Dendera reliefs, which reads them as religious scenes depicting serpent gods and lotus flowers. We have considered the technical challenges that the ancient electricity hypothesis faces, including the need for vacuum technology, filament materials, and adequate power supplies. And we have discussed the broader methodological questions about how we interpret ancient evidence and evaluate competing claims about the past. The Dendera light bulb theory remains one of the most captivating mysteries of the ancient world. It sits at the intersection of archaeology, engineering, art history, and religion, drawing on evidence from multiple fields and provoking passionate debate among researchers of every stripe. Whether you find the electrical interpretation compelling or the conventional religious interpretation more convincing, there is no denying that the reliefs themselves are extraordinary. They are among the most unusual and visually striking images in all of Egyptian art, and they have inspired more curiosity, more debate, and more wonder than almost any other artifact from the ancient world. The questions they raise are profound. How much did the ancients really know? How much have we lost? Are there secrets from the past that we have not yet rediscovered? These questions are not merely academic. They speak to our deepest curiosity about our own origins, our own capabilities, and our place in the long story of human civilization. In the second part of this exploration, we will delve even deeper into these questions. We will examine additional evidence for ancient electrical knowledge from around the world. We will look more closely at the technical feasibility of various ancient lighting technologies. We will consider the sociological and philosophical implications of the lost technology hypothesis. We will hear from both proponents and critics of the ancient electricity theory, examining their strongest arguments and their most significant weaknesses. And we will attempt to reach a balanced and informed conclusion about what the Dendera reliefs really represent and what they tell us about the capabilities and the mysteries of the ancient world. The walls of Dendera have kept their secrets for 2,000 years. The serpent still glows inside its stone bulb, the cable still runs to its mysterious box, and the Djed pillar still stands in silent support. Whether these images depict a forgotten technology or a sacred mythology, they remind us that the ancient world was far richer, far more complex, and far more mysterious than we sometimes imagine. The past is not a simple story. It is a labyrinth of corridors and crypts, of hidden chambers and sealed doors, of images whose meanings we are still struggling to decipher. The journey continues. The lights, whatever they are, still glow in the darkness of the Dendera crypt, waiting for us to understand them. And we will return to them, armed with more knowledge and more questions, in the second part of this exploration. The ancient Egyptians had a saying that captures the spirit of this inquiry perfectly. They said that knowledge is a river that never stops flowing, and that the wise person is one who drinks from it without ceasing. Let us continue to drink from this river, to follow its course wherever it leads, and to remain open to the possibility that the ancients knew more than we have given them credit for. This is the story of the Dendera light bulbs. This is the story of ancient Egyptian electricity, and this story is far from over. Before we pause, let us consider one final thought. Dendera Temple was dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and joy. But Hathor had another aspect that is relevant to our discussion. She was also known as the Eye of Ra, the fierce, burning, illuminating power of the sun god. She was the goddess who brought light into the world, who drove away darkness, who illuminated the hidden places of the earth and the underworld. The reliefs in her temple, whatever they depict, are found in the context of a goddess whose very essence was light. If any ancient Egyptian deity would have been associated with a technology of illumination, it would have been Hathor. If any temple would have housed the sacred mystery of artificial light, it would have been her temple at Dendera. And if any hidden chamber would have contained the secret of that mystery, it would have been the secret crypts beneath her sanctuary, accessible only to her most trusted priests, decorated with images that encoded the sacred knowledge for future generations who might one day rediscover it. This is speculation, of course. It is a narrative, a story woven from threads of evidence, inference, and imagination. But it is a story that resonates with something deep in the human spirit, our desire to believe that the past holds secrets yet to be revealed, that the ancients possessed wisdom we have lost, and that the journey of discovery is not only forward but also backward, into the depths of time and the darkness of forgotten chambers, where the light of ancient knowledge may yet be waiting to be rekindled. We will return in part 2 with the continuation of this extraordinary journey through the hidden chambers of ancient Egyptian knowledge, the laboratories of modern experimental science, and the enduring mystery of the Dendera Light Bulbs. Until then, the serpent glows in its stone bulb, the cable runs to its hidden source, and the ancient Temple of Hathor keeps its secrets beneath the eternal Egyptian stars. The serpent still glows in its stone enclosure. The cable still runs from the base of the bulb to the mysterious box below. The Djed pillar still stands, silent and steadfast, supporting the weight of a question that has haunted researchers for generations. We return now to the hidden crypts of the Dendera Temple, to the ancient banks of the Nile, and to the enduring mystery of whether the ancient Egyptians possessed a technology so advanced, so revolutionary, that its existence would rewrite the entire history of human innovation. We return to the question of ancient electricity. In the first part of our exploration, we examined the Dendera reliefs in detail. We explored the Baghdad Battery. We considered the genuine mystery of tomb illumination, and we weighed the arguments of both proponents and critics of the ancient electricity hypothesis. Now we go deeper. We will examine evidence from beyond Egypt's borders that proponents believe supports the case for ancient electrical knowledge. We will investigate the chemistry and physics that would have been required for ancient lighting technology. We will explore the shadowy world of the Egyptian priesthood and the transmission of esoteric knowledge across millennia. We will consider what modern electrical engineers and physicists have said when confronted with the Dendera images. We will look at lesser-known artifacts and texts that may bear on this question. And ultimately, we will attempt to reach an informed, balanced assessment of what the Dendera reliefs truly represent. The ancient world has not finished speaking to us. There are more secrets to uncover, more chambers to enter, more walls to read. Let us continue. We left off with the observation that the Dendera temple was dedicated to Hathor, the goddess whose very essence was light, whose role in the Egyptian pantheon was intimately connected to illumination, radiance, and the driving away of darkness. This connection between Hathor and light is not a minor detail. It is central to understanding why the reliefs in the Dendera crypts take the form they do, regardless of whether one interprets them as technological or religious imagery. Hathor's association with light was multifaceted. As the Eye of Ra, she was the burning, illuminating force of the sun itself, the power that lit the world and sustained all life. As a stellar deity, she was connected to the star Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, whose annual rising heralded the flooding of the Nile and the renewal of the agricultural cycle. As a goddess of the underworld, she was the one who brought light to the dead, guiding souls through the darkness of the afterlife with her radiant presence. In every aspect of her worship, light was the central metaphor and the central reality. The temple at Dendera was designed to embody and celebrate this connection to light. Its astronomical ceiling mapped the movements of the stars with remarkable precision. Its ritual calendar was synchronized with celestial events, particularly the rising of Sirius and the solstices. Its architecture was oriented to capture and channel sunlight at specific times of the year, creating dramatic lighting effects within the temple during important festivals. The entire building was, in a sense, a machine for the manipulation and celebration of light. Given this context, it is not surprising that the hidden crypts of the temple would contain images related to light and illumination. The question is what kind of light these images depict. Is it the divine light of Hathor and Ra, the spiritual radiance that illuminates the soul and drives away the darkness of ignorance and death? Or is it a physical, technological light, an artificial illumination produced by human ingenuity and ancient science? Or is it perhaps both simultaneously, a sacred technology in which the physical act of producing light was inseparable from the religious act of invoking the divine? This last possibility is one that deserves more attention than it usually receives in the debate. In ancient Egypt, there was no clear boundary between technology and religion, between the practical and the sacred. Every craft was under the patronage of a deity. Every act of creation, whether building a temple or brewing beer, was understood as a participation in the divine order of the cosmos. If the Egyptians had developed a technology for producing light, they would not have understood it as a purely secular achievement. They would have seen it as a manifestation of divine power, a gift from the gods, a sacred mystery to be guarded and venerated. This understanding of the relationship between technology and religion in ancient Egypt is important because it suggests that the sharp distinction between religious interpretation and technological interpretation that dominates the modern debate may be a false dichotomy. The ancient Egyptians would not have recognized such a distinction. For them, a device that produced light would have been simultaneously a piece of technology and a sacred object, a physical tool and a spiritual symbol. The reliefs in the crypt could depict both a technological reality and a religious truth, not because the Egyptians were being deliberately ambiguous, but because for them, these were the same thing. Let us now turn our attention to a body of evidence that is frequently cited by proponents of the ancient electricity theory, but is less well known to the general public. This is the evidence from ancient texts, not Egyptian texts specifically, but texts from across the ancient world that appear to describe electrical phenomena, artificial lighting, or perpetual lamps. The literature of the ancient world contains numerous references to eternal lights or ever-burning lamps, lamps that were said to burn continuously for years, decades, or even centuries without being refueled or relit. These accounts come from a wide variety of sources, including Greek, Roman, Christian, Jewish, and Islamic writers, and they span a period of over 1,000 years. While individual accounts can be dismissed as legend or exaggeration, the sheer number and consistency of these reports has led some researchers to suggest that they may be based on a real phenomenon, a lighting technology that the ancients possessed but that has since been lost. One of the most famous accounts comes from the early Christian writer St. Augustine, who, in his work, The City of God, described a lamp in a temple dedicated to the goddess Venus that could not be extinguished by wind or rain. Augustine attributed this to demonic power, consistent with his Christian worldview, but he did not question the reality of the phenomenon itself. He treated it as a fact that required explanation, not as a fiction to be dismissed. The Roman writer Plutarch, in his account of the temple of Jupiter Ammon in the Libyan desert, described an ever-burning lamp that the priests maintained in the innermost sanctuary. Plutarch, a careful and generally reliable historian, reported this as something he had been told by the temple priests, and while he did not claim to have seen the lamp himself, he treated the report as credible. The medieval Islamic writer Ibn Jubayr, traveling through Egypt in the 12th century, described lights that he saw burning inside ancient structures, lights that appeared to have been burning since antiquity. Other Islamic writers reported similar phenomena, and some speculated that the ancient Egyptians had possessed a secret knowledge of perpetual illumination that had been lost. Perhaps the most detailed and intriguing account of an ancient, ever-burning lamp comes from the Roman period. Several classical authors report that when a sealed tomb was opened, sometimes after centuries of closure, a lamp was found still burning inside. Upon exposure to air, the lamp would flicker and go out as though its mechanism depended on the sealed, airless environment of the tomb. These accounts are found in multiple independent sources, and while they are difficult to verify, their consistency is noteworthy. What are we to make of these accounts? There are several possibilities. First, they may be pure legend, stories invented or embellished to enhance the mystery and prestige of ancient temples and tombs. Ancient writers were not above exaggeration, and the concept of an ever-burning lamp had obvious symbolic and religious significance. A lamp that never went out represented eternal life, divine presence, and the triumph of light over darkness. It was the kind of idea that would be attractive to religious writers and might be reported even without solid evidence. Second, the accounts may be based on misunderstandings. When ancient tombs were opened and objects were found inside that resembled lamps, observers may have assumed that the lamps had been burning continuously since the tomb was sealed. In reality, the lamps may have gone out shortly after the tomb was closed, and the observers were simply seeing old, unused lamps and imagining that they had been burning for centuries. Third, and most intriguingly, the accounts may be based on a real but poorly understood phenomenon. Some researchers have proposed that certain chemical reactions could produce a slow, sustained glow that might be mistaken for a burning lamp. Phosphorescent materials, for example, can absorb energy from their environment and re-emit it as visible light over extended periods. Certain chemical compounds, such as white phosphorus, glow in the presence of oxygen through a process called chemiluminescence. And some biological organisms, including certain fungi and bacteria, produce bioluminescent light that can persist for long periods under the right conditions. Could the ancients have discovered and harnessed one of these phenomena? Could they have created a lamp based on phosphorescence, chemiluminescence, or bioluminescence that would glow for extended periods without a flame? This is a genuinely interesting question, and it connects to the broader ancient electricity hypothesis in an indirect but important way. If the ancients possessed lighting technologies based on principles other than combustion, it would suggest that their understanding of light and energy was more sophisticated than we usually assume, even if those technologies did not involve electricity per se. The proponents of the ancient electricity theory have drawn attention to another set of ancient references that they find particularly compelling. These are the descriptions of the Ark of the Covenant in the Hebrew Bible, the sacred chest said to contain the tablets of the Ten Commandments, which was housed in the innermost sanctum of the tabernacle and later the Temple of Solomon. The Ark is described in the book of Exodus in remarkable detail. It was made of acacia wood, overlaid inside and out with gold. On top of the Ark were two golden cherubim facing each other with their wings outstretched. Between and above the cherubim, the divine presence of God was said to manifest as a visible light or glow, known as the Shekinah. The ark was said to be extremely dangerous to touch or approach without proper preparation. In the book of Samuel, a man named Uzzah touched the ark to steady it when the oxen carrying it stumbled, and he was struck dead instantly. In the book of Leviticus, the high priest Aaron was warned not to enter the area near the ark at all times, lest he die, because the divine presence would manifest there unpredictably. Some proponents of the ancient electricity theory have proposed that the Ark of the Covenant was, in fact, a large capacitor, a device for storing electrical charge. The construction described in Exodus, a wooden box lined with gold on both the inside and outside, is remarkably similar to the construction of a Leyden jar, one of the earliest electrical storage devices, which consisted of a glass jar lined with metal foil on both the inside and outside. A Leyden jar stores electrical charge on the metal surfaces, separated by the insulating glass, and can deliver a powerful shock when discharged. If the Ark of the Covenant was constructed in a similar fashion, with gold foil separated by wood which would serve as an insulator, it could theoretically store a significant electrical charge, especially in the dry desert conditions of the ancient Near East, where static electricity is easily generated. The deaths attributed to touching the Ark in this interpretation were the result of electrical discharge. The glowing light between the cherubim was an electrical phenomenon, perhaps a corona discharge or a sustained arc between the golden figures. The strict rules governing the ark's handling, the requirement that it be carried with wooden poles, the prohibition on touching it, the requirement that the high priest wear specific garments before approaching it, are read as safety protocols designed to prevent accidental electrocution. This interpretation of the ark is fascinating but highly speculative. The construction described in Exodus is detailed, but it is not clear that it would actually function as a capacitor. The wood used in the ark's construction, acacia, has some insulating properties, but it is not a particularly good insulator compared to glass or ceramics. The amount of charge that could be stored on the ark's gold surfaces, even under optimal conditions, would likely be small, probably enough to deliver a startling shock, but not enough to kill a person. And the ark's described construction includes numerous details: the mercy seat on top, the rings on the sides for carrying poles, the cherubim that are consistent with its function as a religious artifact and do not correspond to any known electrical device. Nevertheless, the Ark of the Covenant remains a staple of the ancient electricity discussion, and its inclusion in the broader argument is significant because it extends the hypothesis beyond Egypt to the wider ancient Near East. If the Egyptians had electrical knowledge, proponents argue, they might have shared it with or influenced other civilizations in the region, including the ancient Israelites, who had extensive historical connections with Egypt. The Exodus narrative itself describes the Israelites leaving Egypt and bringing with them the knowledge and skills they had acquired there. Could electrical knowledge have been among those skills? Moving further afield, proponents of the ancient electricity theory have pointed to evidence from other ancient civilizations that they believe supports the case for widespread ancient knowledge of electrical phenomena. In ancient India, the Agastya Samhita, a text attributed to the sage Agastya and generally dated to the 1st millennium BCE, though some scholars place it much later, contains a passage that has been interpreted as describing the construction of an electrochemical cell. The passage instructs the reader to place a copper plate in an earthen pot, to cover it with copper sulfate, and to place wet sawdust and mercury over it. The resulting device, according to the text, will produce a force that can split water into its components. If this passage is accurately translated and correctly dated, it would represent knowledge of electrolysis, the use of electrical current to decompose water into hydrogen and oxygen, a process that was not rediscovered in the West until the late 18th century. The interpretation of this passage is hotly debated. The Sanskrit text is ambiguous in several key places, and different translators have produced significantly different English versions. Some scholars argue that the passage describes a purely alchemical or metallurgical process, not an electrochemical one, and that the electrical interpretation is imposed by modern readers who are looking for evidence of ancient technology. Others point out that even if the passage does describe an electrochemical cell, the Agastya Samhita is difficult to date with precision, and some versions of the text may include interpolations, later additions, that do not reflect the original content. In ancient China, the Han Dynasty alchemist and inventor Wei Boyang, who lived in the 2nd century CE, wrote extensively about the interactions of metals and chemical substances in terms that some researchers have connected to electrochemistry. His famous work, The Kinship of the Three, is primarily an alchemical text dealing with the quest for immortality, but it contains detailed descriptions of chemical reactions between metals and acids that are consistent with electrochemical processes. Again, the interpretation is debated, and mainstream scholars generally read these passages as alchemical rather than electrochemical. In ancient Mesopotamia, beyond the Baghdad Battery itself, there are cuneiform texts that describe metalworking processes in language that some researchers have connected to electroplating. Recipes for applying gold and silver coatings to base metal objects are found in Mesopotamian texts, and while most of these recipes clearly describe conventional techniques such as hammering, soldering, or mercury amalgam plating. A few contain elements that are more difficult to explain without invoking some form of electrical process. The evidence is ambiguous and contested, but it adds another thread to the tapestry of ancient electrical knowledge that proponents are weaving. It is important to note that none of these individual pieces of evidence from India, China, Mesopotamia, or elsewhere is strong enough on its own to establish that ancient civilizations possessed electrical technology. Each piece is ambiguous, debated, and susceptible to alternative interpretations. But proponents of the ancient electricity theory argue that the cumulative weight of evidence from multiple independent civilizations is significant. If references to electrochemical phenomena appear in the texts and artifacts of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, perhaps we are not looking at isolated coincidences, but at traces of a widely distributed body of knowledge that has been lost or obscured over the millennia. Critics respond that the appearance of similar themes in multiple cultures is not evidence of a shared technology. Independent cultures can arrive at similar observations through independent experience. The basic phenomena of static electricity, metal corrosion, and chemical reactions are universal, and any culture that works extensively with metals and chemicals is likely to encounter them. The fact that multiple cultures describe these phenomena does not mean they all possessed a unified electrical technology. It means they all observed the same natural world and described their observations in their own ways. Let us now consider a question that goes to the heart of the ancient electricity debate. If the ancient Egyptians had electric lighting, what evidence should we expect to find, and what evidence do we actually find? This is a crucial question because it allows us to move beyond the interpretation of ambiguous images and texts and focus on the hard physical evidence that any real technology would leave behind. Electric lighting, even in its most primitive form, requires specific materials and produces specific byproducts. If the ancient Egyptians operated electric lights in their temples and tombs, there should be physical traces of this technology in the archaeological record. First, there should be evidence of power generation. Whether the Egyptians used batteries, generators, or some other power source, the equipment they used to produce electrical current would have been made of durable materials, metals, ceramics, stone, that would survive in the archaeological record. The Baghdad Battery, whatever its true function, demonstrates that ancient electrochemical cells would survive for millennia under favorable conditions. If the Egyptians used similar devices on a scale large enough to power lighting systems, we should expect to find remnants of these devices in Egyptian archaeological contexts. We have not. Second, there should be evidence of conductors, the wires or cables used to carry current from the power source to the light. Copper, which was widely available in ancient Egypt and is the most common material for electrical conductors, does not easily corrode in the dry Egyptian climate. Copper wires or cables used in an electrical system should survive in the archaeological record, just as copper tools, vessels, and ornaments from ancient Egypt have survived in vast quantities. We have not found any copper artifacts in Egyptian contexts that can be identified as electrical conductors. Third, there should be evidence of the lighting devices themselves, the bulbs, tubes, or lamps that produce the light. Glass, while fragile, survives well in archaeological contexts, and thousands of ancient Egyptian glass objects have been recovered by archaeologists. If the Egyptians produced glass bulbs or tubes for use as light-producing devices, fragments of these objects should appear in the archaeological record, particularly in the areas where the lights were used, such as temples, tombs, and workshops. We have not found any glass objects in Egyptian contexts that can be identified as components of a lighting system. Fourth, there should be evidence of the infrastructure needed to support an electrical lighting system. This would include mountings for the lights, channels or conduits for the cables, storage areas for the power sources, and workshops where the equipment was manufactured and maintained. None of these features have been identified in any Egyptian archaeological site. Fifth, there should be textual evidence. The ancient Egyptians were prolific record keepers, and their administrative, religious, and literary texts cover an enormous range of topics, from temple inventories and royal decrees to medical prescriptions and love poems. If electrical lighting was used in temples and tombs, we would expect to find references to it in temple inventories, which list the sacred objects and equipment housed in the temple. We would expect to find references in the records of the workers who built and maintained the temples and tombs, records like those found at Deir el-Medina that mention oil lamps and wicks. We would expect to find references in the religious texts that describe the rituals performed in the illuminated spaces. We have not found any such references. The complete absence of physical and textual evidence, other than the Dendera reliefs and the distant Baghdad Battery, is a significant challenge for the ancient electricity hypothesis. Proponents address this challenge primarily through the argument of priestly secrecy, which we discussed in Part 1, and through the argument of destruction and decay, which proposes that the equipment was deliberately destroyed or has deteriorated beyond recognition over the millennia. But these arguments, while not impossible, are difficult to evaluate because they are inherently unfalsifiable. We cannot prove that something was not deliberately destroyed or that it has not decayed beyond recognition. There is another consideration that is often overlooked in discussions of the ancient electricity theory, and it is a consideration that has significant implications for the plausibility of the hypothesis. This is the question of scale. The Dendera reliefs are found in a single temple, in a single set of crypts, in a single location in Egypt. If the ancient Egyptians had developed electrical lighting, why does the evidence appear in only one place? The Egyptian temple-building tradition spanned thousands of years and produced hundreds of temples throughout the Nile Valley and beyond. These temples vary enormously in size, style, and date, from the simple shrines of the earliest periods to the massive complexes of the New Kingdom and the Ptolemaic era. If electrical lighting was a known technology, we would expect to see evidence of it in reliefs, inscriptions, or archaeological remains at multiple sites across multiple periods. But we do not. The Dendera reliefs are unique. No other Egyptian temple contains images that have been interpreted as electric lights. No other temple crypt contains scenes resembling the Dendera bulbs. This uniqueness is difficult to reconcile with the hypothesis that electrical lighting was a practical technology used in Egyptian temples. If it was used, why is it depicted in only one temple? If it was a secret known only to a few priests, how did it survive for the thousands of years between the supposed invention of the technology and the construction of the Dendera Temple in the Ptolemaic period? Proponents have offered several explanations. Perhaps the Dendera Temple was the only place where the technology was used, a unique site with special significance. Perhaps other temples once had similar reliefs, but they have been destroyed by time, weathering, or deliberate defacement. Perhaps the reliefs at Dendera are not depicting a contemporary technology, but are recording a memory or tradition of a technology that existed in the distant past, passed down through priestly lineages, and finally given permanent form on the walls of the new temple. Each of these explanations is possible but speculative. The first explanation raises the question of why such a revolutionary technology would be confined to a single site. The second explanation requires us to assume the existence of evidence that we cannot verify. The third explanation introduces the concept of technological memory, the idea that knowledge of a lost technology could be preserved in oral or textual tradition for thousands of years, a concept that is interesting but difficult to support with concrete evidence. Let us now consider what modern electrical engineers and physicists have said about the Dendera reliefs. The opinions of technical experts are valuable in this debate because they bring a perspective that is different from both the Egyptological and the alternative history viewpoints. Engineers and physicists can evaluate whether the objects depicted in the reliefs could function as electrical devices based on their understanding of physics and engineering principles. Several electrical engineers who have examined the Dendera reliefs have noted the striking visual resemblance between the images and modern electrical components. Some have gone further, producing detailed analyses of the reliefs that identify specific components and propose specific technical functions for each element of the depicted system. These analyses typically identify the bulb-shaped object as a Crookes tube or a Jaissler tube, a glass vessel containing a partial vacuum or a low-pressure gas that glows when electrical current is passed through it. The serpentine line inside the bulb is identified as a gas discharge, the visible glow produced when electrons flow through the low-pressure gas. The cable-like element is identified as a conductor. The box-like object at the base is identified as a power source. The Djed pillar is identified as an insulator or support. One of the most detailed technical analyses of the Dendera reliefs was produced by the Austrian electrical engineer Walter Garn in the 1980s. Garn examined the reliefs from an engineering perspective and concluded that they depicted a functional lighting system based on gas discharge tubes. He argued that the specific details of the reliefs, including the shape of the bulb, the form of the internal element, the configuration of the cable and the base unit, were consistent with the design of a primitive but functional gas discharge lamp. Garn even produced schematic diagrams showing how the depicted system might work, identifying each component and explaining its function in the overall circuit. Garn's analysis was influential in the alternative history community, but it was not accepted by mainstream Egyptologists or by most physicists. Critics pointed out that Garn's analysis was based on the assumption that the reliefs depicted technology, and that this assumption determined his interpretation of every detail. If one begins with the assumption that the images show a lighting system, then every element can be fitted into that framework. The bulb becomes a discharge tube. The snake becomes a gas discharge, the lotus becomes a socket, the Djed becomes an insulator. But if one begins with the assumption that the images are religious, then every element can be fitted into that framework equally well. The bulb becomes a cosmic womb, the snake becomes a deity, the lotus becomes a symbol of creation, the Djed becomes a symbol of stability. The analysis does not independently establish which assumption is correct. It merely shows that the details are consistent with the initial assumption, which is true for both interpretations. Other engineers who have examined the reliefs have been more cautious. Some have acknowledged the visual resemblance to electrical components, but have noted that the reliefs lack certain details that would be necessary for a functional electrical system. There is no clear depiction of a switch or control mechanism. There is no indication of how the power source would be activated or regulated. There is no evidence of the kind of precision engineering that would be required to produce a functional gas discharge tube. These absences are not decisive, since the reliefs are artistic representations rather than engineering diagrams, but they suggest that the images may not be as technically complete as some proponents claim. A particularly interesting perspective on the Dendera debate comes from the field of experimental archaeology, the practice of reconstructing ancient technologies and testing whether they work. We mentioned in Part 1 that a group of researchers built a working model based on the Dendera reliefs and successfully produced light from it. This experiment deserves a more detailed examination. The experiment was conducted by several researchers who constructed a large glass tube, roughly the size and shape depicted in the Dendera reliefs. They evacuated the tube to create a partial vacuum, introduced a serpentine electrode inside the tube, and applied electrical current. When the current was activated, the residual gas inside the tube glowed with a soft, purplish light, similar to the glow of a neon sign. The experiment demonstrated that the form depicted in the reliefs could, in principle, function as a light-producing device. However, several important qualifications must be noted. First, the glass tube was produced using modern glass-blowing techniques. Ancient Egyptian glass technology, while impressive, could not produce large, thin-walled, transparent glass tubes of the required quality. Egyptian glass was typically produced by core forming, a technique that involved wrapping molten glass around a clay core or by casting molten glass into molds. These techniques produced thick-walled, often opaque or translucent vessels that would not be suitable for use as gas discharge tubes. Glass blowing, which allows the production of thin-walled transparent vessels, was not developed until the 1st century BCE, around the same time the Dendera Temple was being constructed. Even then, early blown glass was crude by modern standards. Second, the vacuum was created using a modern vacuum pump. Creating a partial vacuum inside a sealed glass vessel is a significant engineering challenge that requires specialized equipment. The ancient Egyptians had no known vacuum technology. They did not have air pumps, vacuum chambers, or any of the tools that would be needed to evacuate a glass tube. Proponents have suggested that a partial vacuum might have been created by heating the tube, filling it with steam, and then allowing the steam to condense, drawing out some of the air. This technique was used in some early European vacuum experiments, and it does not require advanced equipment, but it produces only a very rough vacuum, and it is not clear that it would be sufficient to support a gas discharge of the kind demonstrated in the experiment. Third, the electrical current was supplied by a modern power source. The experiment did not attempt to power the discharge tube using a Baghdad battery or any ancient-style power source. This is a significant omission because the voltage required to sustain a gas discharge is typically quite high, often several hundred to several thousand volts, depending on the gas pressure and the tube dimensions. A single Baghdad battery produces about 2 volts. Even a large array of batteries connected in series would struggle to produce the voltage needed for a sustained gas discharge. Proponents have suggested that some form of voltage multiplication or transformation could have been used, but there is no evidence that the ancients possessed knowledge of transformers, induction coils, or other voltage multiplying devices. Despite these qualifications, the experiment remains significant. It demonstrated that the forms depicted in the Dendera reliefs are not random or arbitrary shapes. They correspond to a real physical configuration that can produce light under appropriate conditions. This does not prove that the ancients built and operated such devices, but it does add a layer of credibility to the visual argument that the reliefs depict technology rather than purely mythological imagery. Let us now turn to a topic that is central to the ancient electricity debate but is seldom discussed in sufficient depth: the question of ancient metallurgy and its relationship to electrical phenomena. The ancient Egyptians were master metalworkers. They worked with copper, gold, silver, electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and in later periods, iron and bronze. Their metalworking techniques included casting, hammering, annealing, soldering, and various forms of surface treatment, including gilding and inlaying. The quality of their metalwork is evident in the exquisite jewelry, vessels, tools, and ornamental objects that have survived in the archaeological record. Metalworking involves exposing metals to extreme heat and to various chemical reactions, and it inevitably brings the metalworker into contact with electrical phenomena, even if those phenomena are not recognized or understood. The triboelectric effect, the generation of static charge through friction, would have been encountered regularly by metalworkers handling and polishing metal surfaces. Thermoelectric effects, the generation of small voltages at the junction of two different metals, would have occurred in the smithy whenever different metals were brought into contact at high temperatures. And electrochemical effects, the generation of voltage when different metals are immersed in acidic or alkaline solutions, would have been encountered during various metalworking processes involving chemical treatments. The question is whether any ancient metalworkers noticed these phenomena and attempted to harness them. The triboelectric effect is subtle and might easily be dismissed as a curiosity. The thermoelectric effect produces very small voltages that would be difficult to detect without sensitive instruments, but the electrochemical effect is more pronounced and more likely to attract attention. If a metalworker noticed that placing two different metals in an acidic solution produced a tingling sensation when both metals were touched simultaneously, or that the solution bubbled or changed color in unusual ways, that metalworker might have been curious enough to investigate further. This is speculative, of course. We have no direct evidence that ancient metalworkers investigated electrochemical phenomena, but the possibility is not unreasonable. Ancient metalworkers were skilled empirical scientists who spent their lives observing and manipulating the properties of matter. They discovered the principles of smelting, alloying, tempering, and annealing through centuries of experimentation and observation. The idea that they might also have discovered basic electrochemical principles through similar processes of empirical investigation is not implausible. If the Baghdad Battery is indeed an electrochemical cell, it may represent exactly this kind of empirical discovery, a practical application of an observed phenomenon by skilled craftspeople who may not have understood the underlying science but who were able to harness the effect for practical purposes, perhaps electroplating, perhaps medical treatment, perhaps some other application we have not considered. The question of electroplating deserves further exploration because it represents perhaps the most plausible practical application of ancient electrochemistry, and because it connects the Baghdad Battery to the broader question of ancient technological capability in a concrete and testable way. Electroplating is the process of depositing a thin layer of one metal onto the surface of another using an electrical current. In modern electroplating, the object to be plated is immersed in a solution containing ions of the plating metal, and an electrical current is passed through the solution. The current causes the metal ions to migrate to the surface of the object and deposit there as a thin, even coating. The process requires a power source, a suitable electrolyte solution, and the object to be plated. Some ancient metal objects have been found with extremely thin, uniform metal coatings that are difficult to explain by conventional metalworking techniques such as fire gilding, mercury amalgam plating, or leaf application. These objects have been cited by proponents of the ancient electricity theory as evidence of ancient electroplating. If some ancient metal objects were indeed electroplated, this would demonstrate that ancient craftspeople not only knew how to generate electrical current, but knew how to apply it for practical purposes. However, the evidence for ancient electroplating is contested. The objects in question have been examined by various researchers using different analytical techniques, and the results have been inconsistent. Some analyses have concluded that the coatings are consistent with electroplating, while others have concluded that they are consistent with conventional metalworking techniques. The problem is that the microscopic characteristics of electroplated coatings and conventionally applied coatings can be very similar, making it difficult to distinguish between them definitively, especially on objects that are thousands of years old and have been subject to various forms of corrosion and degradation. One study that is frequently cited in this context was conducted by Erich, a German researcher who experimented with Baghdad Battery replicas in the 1970s. Erich reported that he successfully used a Baghdad battery to electroplate a small silver figurine with a thin layer of gold. His experiment demonstrated that a single Baghdad battery could produce enough current for electroplating, at least on a small scale. However, Erich's results have been questioned by other researchers, and attempts to replicate his experiment have produced mixed results. The electroplating question is important because it represents the most testable aspect of the ancient electricity hypothesis. If we could demonstrate conclusively that certain ancient metal objects were electroplated, it would provide strong evidence that ancient craftspeople possessed and applied electrochemical knowledge. But the evidence remains ambiguous and the question remains open. We have now examined the primary evidence for the ancient electricity hypothesis from multiple angles: the Dendera reliefs, the Baghdad Battery, the ever-burning lamps, the textual references from various ancient civilizations, the experimental reconstructions, and the metallurgical evidence. Let us now step back and consider the broader implications of the hypothesis, both for our understanding of the ancient world and for our approach to studying the past. The ancient electricity hypothesis, if true, would have profound implications for the history of technology. It would mean that the development of electrical knowledge was not a product of the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, as conventionally understood, but had much older roots stretching back thousands of years into antiquity. It would mean that the conventional narrative of technological progress, in which humanity moved gradually from simple to complex technologies over millennia, is incomplete or inaccurate. And it would mean that our understanding of ancient civilizations is fundamentally flawed, that we have seriously underestimated their capabilities and their understanding of the natural world. These implications are exciting to many people, particularly those who feel that mainstream scholarship is too conservative, too dismissive of ancient achievements, and too committed to a narrative of linear progress that may not reflect the true complexity of human history. The idea that the ancients knew more than we give them credit for resonates with a deep-seated human intuition that the past was not simply a primitive precursor to the present, but a rich and complex world with its own forms of knowledge and its own technological achievements. But the implications are also troubling to many scholars, not because they are inherently unwelcome, but because they rest on a foundation of evidence that is, at best, ambiguous. The Dendera reliefs can be interpreted in multiple ways. The Baghdad Battery may or may not be a battery. The ever-burning lamps may or may not have existed. The textual references from India, China, and elsewhere may or may not describe electrical phenomena. And the physical evidence that we would expect to find if the ancient Egyptians had electrical lighting, the wires, the bulbs, the power sources, the infrastructure, is entirely absent from the archaeological record. This does not mean the hypothesis is definitively wrong. Science advances by considering possibilities, testing them against evidence, and revising conclusions as new evidence emerges. If new archaeological discoveries were to produce physical evidence of ancient electrical technology, the hypothesis would be dramatically strengthened. If an Egyptian text describing electrical phenomena were to be discovered, the landscape of the debate would shift fundamentally. The possibility remains open, and it should remain open, because the history of science is full of examples of ideas that were initially dismissed by the mainstream, but were later vindicated by new evidence. But until such evidence emerges, the ancient electricity hypothesis must be evaluated on the basis of the evidence we have. And that evidence, while intriguing and thought-provoking, does not yet meet the threshold of proof that would be required to overturn the conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian technology. Let us now consider a perspective that is sometimes lost in the heat of the ancient electricity debate, the perspective of the ancient Egyptians themselves. When we look at the Dendera reliefs, we bring with us all the assumptions, the knowledge, and the visual vocabulary of our own time. We see light bulbs because we know what light bulbs look like. We see cables because we know what cables look like. We see filaments because we know what filaments look like. But what did the ancient Egyptians see when they looked at these images? To answer this question, we need to understand the religious and cosmological context in which the reliefs were created. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera was not a museum or a science laboratory. It was a house of the gods, a sacred space where the boundary between the human and the divine was thinnest, where the cosmic order was maintained through ritual action, and where the mysteries of creation, death, and rebirth were enacted in elaborate ceremonial performances. Every image on its walls served a religious purpose. Every relief was a component of a vast, interconnected symbolic system designed to maintain cosmic harmony and ensure the continued functioning of the universe. The crypts where the light bulb reliefs are found were among the most sacred and restricted spaces in the temple. They housed the most precious ritual objects and the most secret images. The reliefs on their walls were not casual decorations. They were sacred texts, visual narratives that recorded the most profound truths of the Hathoric religious tradition. Everything in these crypts was charged with religious meaning, and interpreting the images requires engaging with that meaning on its own terms. The serpent emerging from the lotus in Egyptian religious terms is a powerful image of creation. The lotus, as we discussed earlier, represents the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. The serpent represents the divine energy that animated the creation, the life force that brought the world into being. The emergence of the serpent from the lotus is the emergence of life from chaos, of order from disorder, of light from darkness. It is the Egyptian creation story rendered in visual form. The bulb-shaped enclosure around the serpent can be understood as the cosmic egg, the womb of creation, the protected space in which the divine serpent develops before emerging into the world. The concept of the cosmic egg is found in numerous ancient mythological traditions, and it has parallels in Egyptian cosmological thought. The enclosure protects the serpent during the vulnerable process of creation, shielding it from the forces of chaos until it is ready to emerge. The Djed pillar in this context represents the stable foundation of the created world, the pillar that supports the sky and maintains the cosmic order. Its presence in the scene anchors the creation narrative in the concept of stability and endurance, assuring the viewer that the world created by the divine serpent will stand firm and unshaken. The cable-like element may represent the umbilical cord of creation, the connection between the divine source and the created world. Or it may represent the stem of the lotus, the organic connection between the flower and the water from which it grows. The box-like object at the base may represent the primordial waters themselves, the source from which all creation emerges. In this reading, the entire scene is a coherent and powerful expression of Egyptian creation theology, rendered in the symbolic visual language of the temple. Every element has a clear religious meaning that connects to the broader themes of the Dendera Temple and the worship of Hathor. The scene does not depict technology. It depicts the most fundamental truth of Egyptian religion, the origin of the world, the emergence of light from darkness, the triumph of order over chaos. This religious interpretation is widely accepted among Egyptologists, and it has the significant advantage of being consistent with the inscriptions that accompany the reliefs. The inscriptions identify the serpent as Harsamtis, the divine figure emerging from the lotus. They describe the scene in religious terms. They make no reference to technology, to electricity, to lighting equipment, or to any practical application of the depicted objects. The texts and the images tell the same story, the story of divine creation. But even as we acknowledge the strength of the religious interpretation, we must also acknowledge its limitations. The religious interpretation explains the general symbolism of the scene, but it does not fully account for every specific visual detail. Why is the serpent enclosed in a bulb-shaped container? The motif of a serpent emerging from a lotus is found elsewhere in Egyptian art, but the serpent is not typically enclosed in a transparent, bulb-shaped envelope. This is an unusual feature that is specific to the Dendera reliefs and that the religious interpretation does not completely explain. Why does the envelope have what appears to be a fitting or socket at its base? This is a detail that would make sense in a technological context, but is harder to explain in a purely religious one. Why does a thick, braided line extend from this fitting to a box on the ground? Lotus stems in Egyptian art are typically depicted as thin, delicate lines, not as thick, braided cords. The specific visual form of this element is more consistent with a cable than with a stem. These details are the crux of the debate. The general symbolism of the scene is clearly religious. The specific visual details are suggestive of technology. The question is which takes priority, the general meaning or the specific form. Egyptologists argue that the general meaning should take priority because it is supported by the inscriptions and by the broader context of Egyptian art and religion. Alternative researchers argue that the specific form should take priority because it provides direct visual evidence that cannot be explained away by general symbolic analysis. This disagreement is unlikely to be resolved by further analysis of the existing evidence. Both sides have examined the reliefs exhaustively, and both have produced detailed, internally consistent interpretations that account for the major features of the images. What is needed is new evidence, new discoveries that could tip the balance in one direction or the other. An Egyptian text describing electrical phenomena, an Egyptian artifact that functions as an electrical component. A parallel set of images from another Egyptian temple, a chemical analysis of the crypt walls that reveals traces of electrical activity. Any of these discoveries would significantly advance the debate, but until such discoveries are made, the debate will continue, each side convinced of its interpretation, each side pointing to the same images on the same walls and seeing something fundamentally different. There's an aspect of the ancient electricity discussion that connects to a broader and profoundly important question about how knowledge was transmitted in the ancient world. This is the question of the mystery schools, the secretive educational institutions through which the most advanced knowledge of the ancient world was transmitted from teacher to student across generations. The existence of mystery schools in the ancient world is well documented. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, the Orphic mysteries, the Pythagorean school, the Hermetic tradition, and various other esoteric institutions operated throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, offering their initiates access to knowledge that was not available to the general public. The content of these mysteries was closely guarded, and initiates were sworn to secrecy. As a result, we know relatively little about what was actually taught in these institutions, despite the numerous references to them in ancient literature. Many ancient writers explicitly connected the mystery traditions of Greece and Rome to Egypt. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed that many Greek religious practices were derived from Egypt. Plato, in several of his dialogues, depicted Egyptian priests as repositories of ancient wisdom that the Greeks had forgotten. Plutarch wrote extensively about Egyptian religion and its connections to Greek philosophical traditions. And the Hermetic tradition, which became enormously influential in the later ancient world and during the Renaissance, was explicitly presented as Egyptian wisdom, attributed to the legendary sage Hermes Trismegistus, who was identified with the Egyptian god Thoth. The connection between the mystery schools and the ancient electricity hypothesis is speculative but intriguing. If the ancient Egyptians possessed advanced technological knowledge, including knowledge of electricity, this knowledge would likely have been transmitted through the same channels that carried other forms of esoteric wisdom, through the secretive, hierarchical institutions of the temple priesthood. The mystery schools of Greece and Rome, which were influenced by Egyptian traditions, may have preserved echoes or fragments of this knowledge, encoded in symbolic and allegorical forms that concealed the practical content from the uninitiated. This idea has been explored by numerous writers in the esoteric and alternative history traditions. Some have proposed that the symbol systems of alchemy, astrology, and Hermeticism contain encoded references to electrical and electromagnetic phenomena, disguised in the language of mythology and philosophy to protect them from those who were not prepared to receive them. The alchemical quest for the philosopher's stone, for example, has been interpreted by some researchers as an allegory for the search for a reliable power source. The elixir of life has been interpreted as a metaphor for electrical current. These interpretations are highly speculative and are not accepted by mainstream scholars, but they illustrate the depth and complexity of the intellectual tradition that surrounds the ancient electricity hypothesis. The mystery school connection also provides another possible explanation for why the knowledge of ancient electricity was lost. If this knowledge was transmitted exclusively through oral teaching within secretive institutions, it was always vulnerable to disruption. A single generation of failed transmission, whether due to war, plague, persecution, or simple accident, could result in the permanent loss of the entire body of knowledge. The decline of the traditional Egyptian priesthood under Greek, Roman, and Christian influence, and the eventual closure of the last Egyptian temples in the 6th century CE, would have been precisely the kind of disruption that could destroy a chain of oral transmission that had endured for centuries or millennia. Let us consider now a modern parallel that illuminates some aspects of the ancient electricity debate. In the mid-20th century, anthropologist and explorer Thor Heyerdahl challenged the prevailing assumption that ancient peoples could not have crossed the world's oceans. Mainstream scholars dismissed the idea of transoceanic contact between ancient civilizations, arguing that the boats available to ancient peoples were too small, too fragile, and too primitive to survive long ocean voyages. Heyerdahl responded by building a replica of an ancient Egyptian reed boat named Ra and sailing it across the Atlantic Ocean, demonstrating that such a voyage was at least theoretically possible. Heyerdahl's expedition did not prove that the ancient Egyptians had actually crossed the Atlantic. It proved that they could have, using the technology available to them. The experiment changed the terms of the debate by demonstrating that the conventional assumption about the limitations of ancient technology was wrong, or at least overstated. What had been dismissed as impossible was shown to be possible, and the burden of proof shifted. The experimental reconstruction of the Dendera light discussed earlier occupies a similar position in the ancient electricity debate. It does not prove that the ancient Egyptians had electric lighting, but it demonstrates that the forms depicted in the Dendera reliefs could function as lighting devices, at least in principle. It challenges the conventional assumption that the reliefs cannot depict technology, and it shifts the terms of the debate by showing that what has been dismissed as impossible is, in fact, possible. The analogy is not perfect, of course. Heyerdahl used only materials and techniques available to the ancient Egyptians, while the experimental reconstruction of the Dendera light used modern materials and a modern power source. This is a significant difference, but the underlying principle is the same. Conventional assumptions about the limits of ancient technology should be tested, not simply accepted. And experiments that challenge those assumptions, even imperfect experiments, make a valuable contribution to our understanding of what the ancients could and could not have achieved. There is another dimension to the Dendera mystery that we have not yet explored, and it concerns the peculiar acoustics of the temple crypts. Some researchers who have visited the Dendera crypts have noted that the narrow, enclosed spaces have unusual acoustic properties. Sounds produced in the crypts resonate and amplify in distinctive ways, creating an effect that some have described as otherworldly or disorienting. Acoustic effects in ancient temples and tombs have been documented at numerous sites around the world, and there is growing evidence that at least some of these effects were intentional, that the builders of these structures deliberately designed them to produce specific sounds or to amplify the human voice in particular ways. Research at sites such as Newgrange in Ireland, the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, and various megalithic structures in Europe has shown that these structures were designed to resonate at specific frequencies, often frequencies that are known to produce physiological effects in the human body, including altered states of consciousness. The relevance of acoustics to the ancient electricity debate is indirect but potentially significant. If the ancient Egyptians understood sound and resonance well enough to design spaces with specific acoustic properties, it would suggest a level of scientific understanding that goes beyond what is conventionally attributed to them. It would not prove that they understood electricity, but it would demonstrate that they were capable of observing, understanding, and applying physical principles in sophisticated ways. Some proponents of the ancient electricity theory have gone further, suggesting that the acoustic properties of the crypts may be related to the electrical phenomena depicted in the reliefs. Certain types of electrical discharge produce sound, and some researchers have proposed that the buzzing or humming of an electrical device might have been incorporated into the ritual activities of the temple, adding an auditory dimension to the visual spectacle of the electric lights. This is speculation, but it connects to the broader theme of the ancient Egyptian temple as a multisensory environment designed to overwhelm the senses and transport the participant into a state of heightened awareness and spiritual receptivity. Throughout this exploration, we have repeatedly encountered the fundamental tension between what the ancient Egyptians might have known and what we can prove they knew. This tension is inherent in the study of the ancient world, and it is not unique to the question of electricity. There are many aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization that remain poorly understood, not because the Egyptians were primitive, but because much of their knowledge has been lost to the passage of time. Consider the question of how the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. Despite decades of research and numerous proposed theories, there is no consensus among scholars about the specific methods used to quarry, transport, and assemble the roughly 2.3 million stone blocks that make up the pyramid. The conventional explanations involving ramps, levers, and human labor are plausible but not proven, and each proposed method has significant weaknesses and unanswered questions. Some aspects of the pyramid's construction, such as the precise alignment of the base with the cardinal directions, the remarkable accuracy of the stone cutting, and the engineering of the internal chambers, suggest a level of mathematical and engineering knowledge that is difficult to reconcile with the simple tools attested in the archaeological record. Consider the question of Egyptian medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to approximately 1600 BCE, contains remarkably sophisticated descriptions of surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and diagnostic methods. The medical knowledge displayed in this text is far advanced beyond what we might expect from a Bronze Age civilization, and it suggests that the Egyptian physicians possessed a depth of empirical understanding that is not fully reflected in the archaeological record of their tools and equipment. Consider the question of Egyptian astronomy. The alignment of temples, pyramids, and other structures with celestial events demonstrates a level of astronomical knowledge that required centuries of careful observation and mathematical analysis. The Dendera zodiac itself is a document of remarkable astronomical sophistication, depicting the constellations and planetary positions with considerable accuracy. In each of these cases, the evidence suggests that the ancient Egyptians knew more than we can fully document from the surviving record. Their achievements consistently push against the boundaries of what we believe was possible with their known technology. This does not mean they had electricity, but it does mean that our models of ancient Egyptian capability may be incomplete, and that we should be cautious about dismissing any ancient achievement as impossible simply because we cannot explain how it was accomplished. The debate over the Dendera light bulbs is ultimately a debate about the nature of knowledge itself. What counts as knowledge? How is knowledge created, transmitted, preserved, and lost? How do we distinguish genuine knowledge from speculation, from wishful thinking, from pareidolia? The conventional model of knowledge creation, which underlies the mainstream rejection of the ancient electricity hypothesis, is based on the assumption that genuine knowledge leaves traces. If the ancient Egyptians possessed electrical technology, there should be physical evidence of it, in the form of artifacts, inscriptions, and archaeological remains. The absence of such evidence is, in this model, strong evidence that the technology did not exist. The alternative model, which underlies the ancient electricity hypothesis, challenges this assumption. It proposes that knowledge can exist without leaving the kinds of traces that modern archaeology is designed to detect. Knowledge that was transmitted orally, that was confined to a small elite, that was encoded in symbolic forms, or that was deliberately concealed could persist for centuries without producing the kind of evidence that conventional archaeology would recognize. In this model, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply a reflection of the limitations of our methods of investigation. Both models have merit, and neither is entirely satisfactory. The conventional model is right to insist on evidence and to be skeptical of claims that are not supported by physical proof, but it is also limited by its own assumptions, and it has a history of being wrong about the capabilities of ancient peoples. The alternative model is right to recognize the limitations of our evidence and to remain open to the possibility that the ancients knew more than we think. But it is also vulnerable to the temptation of seeing what we want to see, of constructing elaborate theories on the basis of ambiguous evidence, and of dismissing inconvenient counterarguments by invoking secrecy and loss. The most productive approach, perhaps, is one that combines the rigor of the conventional model with the open-mindedness of the alternative model. We should insist on evidence, but we should also recognize that our understanding of the past is always incomplete. We should be skeptical of extraordinary claims, but we should also be willing to consider extraordinary evidence. And we should always remain aware of our own biases, both the bias toward dismissing the unusual and the bias toward embracing the exotic. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, let us return one final time to the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. Let us walk through the great hypostyle hall, past the towering columns with their Hathor-headed capitals. Let us descend into the narrow passages that lead to the hidden crypts. Let us stand before the reliefs that have inspired so much wonder and so much debate. Let us look at the images one more time with fresh eyes and open minds. What do we see? We see objects that look like light bulbs. We see something that looks like a filament. We see something that looks like a cable. We see something that looks like a power source. The visual resemblance is real, it is not an illusion, and it is not the product of wishful thinking. Something in these images connects with our modern understanding of electrical technology in a way that is immediate, visceral, and striking. But we also see something else. We see a serpent emerging from a lotus. We see a Djed pillar standing firm. We see a cosmic egg enclosing the divine life force. We see the creation of the world, the emergence of light from darkness, the triumph of order over chaos. We see the core of Egyptian religious thought rendered in the precise symbolic language of temple art. These two visions, the technological and the religious, overlay each other perfectly. The serpent is the filament, the lotus is the socket, the cosmic egg is the glass envelope, the Djed pillar is the insulator, the cable of creation is the electrical conductor, the primordial water box is the battery. Every element of the religious interpretation has a technological counterpart, and every element of the technological interpretation has a religious counterpart. Is this coincidence? Is it pareidolia? Is it evidence of a lost technology encoded in religious symbolism? Or is it something else entirely, a reminder that the categories we use to organize our understanding of the world, technology and religion, science and myth, physical and spiritual, may not apply to the ancient world in the way we assume? The ancient Egyptians did not recognize a boundary between the sacred and the technological. For them, every act of creation was a divine act. Every tool was a gift from the gods. Every discovery was a revelation. If they did possess electrical technology, they would have understood it as a manifestation of divine power, not as a secular achievement. They would have venerated it as a sacred mystery, guarded it as a holy secret, and depicted it in the symbolic language of their religion. The reliefs in the Dendera crypt would be exactly what we might expect such a depiction to look like. And if they did not possess electrical technology, if the reliefs are purely religious in nature, depicting mythological narratives with no technological content, then the remarkable visual resemblance to modern electrical components is one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of art. A coincidence that has sparked a debate lasting decades. A coincidence that has inspired millions of people to look more closely at the achievements of the ancient world. A coincidence that has reminded us forcefully and memorably that the past is not as simple or as well understood as we sometimes like to think. There is something profoundly humbling about standing before an artifact that we cannot fully explain. The Dendera reliefs are such artifacts. Whether they depict ancient technology or ancient mythology, they challenge our certainty and invite our curiosity. They remind us that there are questions about the past that we have not yet answered, mysteries that we have not yet solved, secrets that the ancient stones have not yet surrendered. The Great Pyramid stands in the desert, its construction methods still debated. The Antikythera mechanism sits in a museum in Athens, a Greek clockwork computer found in a Roman-era shipwreck that was not supposed to exist according to our models of ancient technology. The Dendera reliefs glow in the darkness of their hidden crypt, their meaning disputed, their secrets intact. These artifacts are gifts from the past. They are invitations to inquiry, challenges to certainty, provocations to curiosity. They tell us that the story of human civilization is longer, stranger, and more complex than any single narrative can capture. They tell us that the ancients were not simple people leading simple lives. They were complex, creative, intelligent beings who observed the world around them with keen eyes, who experimented with the materials at their disposal, who developed sophisticated solutions to practical problems, and who encoded their deepest knowledge in forms that have survived for millennia, waiting for future generations to discover and decipher them. Whether the ancient Egyptians had electric lighting is a question that may never be definitively answered. The evidence we have is suggestive but not conclusive. The arguments on both sides are compelling but not decisive. The mystery endures, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the greatest value of the Dendera reliefs lies not in the answer they provide to a specific question about ancient technology, but in the larger questions they inspire about the nature of knowledge, the capabilities of ancient civilizations, and the limits of our own understanding. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera has stood for over 2,000 years. It has witnessed the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the coming of Christianity, the Arab conquest, the medieval period, the age of European exploration, and the birth of modern archaeology. Through all of these transformations, the reliefs in its hidden crypts have remained unchanged. The serpent glowing in its stone bulb, the cable running to its mysterious source, the Djed pillar standing firm beneath its enigmatic burden. Generations of scholars, explorers, adventurers, and dreamers have stood before these images and wondered what they mean. Some have seen the fingerprints of an advanced ancient technology. Others have seen the symbolic language of a sophisticated religious tradition. Still others have seen something in between, a blending of the technological and the sacred that defies our modern categories and challenges our modern assumptions. The debate will continue. New discoveries will be made, new interpretations will be proposed, new evidence will emerge that may support or undermine the existing theories. The story of the Dendera Light Bulbs is not over. It is an ongoing investigation, a living inquiry that draws new participants with each passing year. What we can say with certainty is this: the ancient Egyptians were a civilization of extraordinary achievement. They built monuments that have endured for millennia. They created art of breathtaking beauty and complexity. They developed a system of writing that recorded their thoughts, their beliefs, and their knowledge for future generations. They observed the natural world with precision and insight. And they left behind, in the hidden chambers of a temple dedicated to the goddess of love and light, a set of images that continue to challenge, inspire, and mystify us to this day. The question of ancient Egyptian electricity touches on something deeper than technology. It touches on our relationship with the past, our assumptions about human capability, and our understanding of how civilizations rise and fall. Every generation believes itself to be the pinnacle of human achievement, the most advanced, the most knowledgeable, the most capable society that has ever existed. And every generation is, to some extent, wrong about this. The future will look back on our time and see limitations and blind spots that we cannot perceive from within our own moment in history. The ancient Egyptians surely had their own blind spots and their own limitations. But they also had insights and capabilities that we have not fully appreciated. The history of Egyptology is a history of constant revision, of discoveries that overturned established assumptions and revealed a civilization more complex, more sophisticated, and more capable than previous generations of scholars had believed. The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 revealed a wealth of artistic and material culture that astonished the world. The decipherment of the Rosetta Stone opened a window into the Egyptian mind that had been closed for over 1,000 years. The excavation of the workers' village at Deir el-Medina revealed the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians in extraordinary detail. Each of these discoveries expanded our understanding of what the ancient Egyptians were capable of. Each one revealed a civilization that was richer, more nuanced, and more accomplished than we had previously imagined. It is not unreasonable to think that future discoveries will continue this pattern, revealing aspects of Egyptian knowledge and capability that we do not yet suspect. Whether those future discoveries will include evidence of ancient electrical technology remains to be seen. The Dendera reliefs sit patiently in their crypt, waiting for the next generation of investigators to examine them with new tools, new methods, and new perspectives. The mystery endures. The question remains open. And the search for answers continues. In the end, the Dendera light bulb debate is a mirror that reflects our own assumptions and beliefs back at us. Those who see technology in the reliefs bring with them a belief that the ancients were capable of more than mainstream scholarship acknowledges. Those who see religion in the reliefs bring with them a trust in the methods and conclusions of conventional Egyptology. Both groups look at the same images and see different things because they bring different assumptions, different frameworks, and different questions to the encounter. This is not a weakness of the debate, it is a strength. The Dendera reliefs have forced us to think more carefully about how we interpret ancient evidence, how we evaluate competing claims, and how we balance open-mindedness with rigor. They have challenged the comfortable assumption that we understand the ancient world as well as we think we do. They have inspired millions of people to learn more about ancient Egypt, about the history of technology, and about the nature of scientific inquiry itself. Whatever the reliefs ultimately mean, their impact on our culture and our curiosity has been profound. Let us close with a final reflection on what the Dendera reliefs teach us about the nature of mystery itself. A mystery is not simply a question that has not been answered. It is a question that resists easy answers, that pushes back against our attempts to resolve it, that remains alive and challenging no matter how much effort we devote to it. The Dendera reliefs are a genuine mystery. They have resisted easy answers for decades. They have been examined by Egyptologists, engineers, physicists, artists, historians, and amateur enthusiasts, and no one has produced an interpretation that satisfies everyone. The mystery endures because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, genuinely open to multiple readings, genuinely resistant to definitive resolution. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a feature of the ancient world. The past is not transparent. It does not yield its secrets easily. It is a foreign country, as the saying goes, and they do things differently there. The images on the walls of the Dendera crypt were created by people who lived in a world radically different from our own, who thought in ways we can only partially reconstruct, who used symbols and conventions that we can only partially understand. When we look at their images, we see through a glass darkly glimpsing fragments of a reality that we cannot fully apprehend. The ancient Egyptians lived for over 3,000 years in the Nile Valley. They built a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and resilience, a civilization that produced some of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of humanity. They observed the stars with precision, mapped the cosmos with care, built monuments of staggering scale and beauty, and developed a religious and philosophical tradition of extraordinary depth and subtlety. Whatever the Dendera reliefs depict, they are a product of this civilization, and they deserve to be treated with the respect and the curiosity that such a civilization commands. The serpent in the stone bulb has been glowing for 2,000 years. The cable has been running to its source for 2,000 years. The Djed pillar has been standing in its place for 2,000 years. These images have outlasted empires, survived invasions, weathered the passage of centuries, and endured into our own time as vivid and as mysterious as the day they were carved. They are waiting for us to understand them. They are waiting for the key that will unlock their meaning. They are waiting for the discovery that will resolve the debate one way or the other. Until that day comes, they will continue to glow in the darkness of the Dendera crypt, silent witnesses to a knowledge that may have been lost or a mythology that has been misunderstood, or a truth so profound that it encompasses both technology and religion, both physics and metaphysics, both the practical and the sacred. The Temple of Hathor stands beneath the eternal Egyptian sky, its columns rising toward the stars, its crypts descending into the earth. Between the sky and the earth, between the light and the darkness, between the known and the unknown, the Dendera reliefs hold their secret, and the world watches and wonders and waits. The Nile still flows past the temple at Dendera as it has flowed for millennia. The desert sun still rises each morning over the ancient walls, illuminating the Hathor-headed columns with the same light that fell on them when the temple was new. The stars still wheel overhead in the same patterns that the ancient astronomers mapped on the famous zodiac ceiling. The rhythms of the natural world continue, unchanged and unchanging, connecting our time to theirs in an unbroken chain of light and darkness, day and night, question and answer. Somewhere in the space between what we know and what we do not know, between what the evidence shows and what the evidence merely suggests, the truth about the Dendera light bulbs resides. It may be a truth about technology, about the extraordinary capabilities of a civilization that we have underestimated. It may be a truth about religion, about the profound symbolic language of a spiritual tradition that we have not fully deciphered. Or it may be a truth about the nature of truth itself, about the way that reality resists our categories and confounds our expectations, presenting itself in forms that are simultaneously familiar and strange, recognizable and alien, clear and mysterious. The ancient Egyptians believed that knowledge was sacred, that truth was divine, and that the pursuit of understanding was the highest calling of the human spirit. They inscribed their knowledge on temple walls and tomb ceilings, in papyrus scrolls and stone monuments, trusting that future generations would be worthy to receive it. They built their civilization to endure, and it has endured, its monuments standing, its texts legible, its mysteries intact. We are those future generations. The knowledge they inscribed is waiting for us. The mysteries they left behind are ours to solve. The questions they posed in stone and in silence are ours to answer. And the extraordinary images in the crypts of Dendera, whether they depict ancient electricity or ancient mythology, are among the most powerful and provocative questions the ancient world has ever asked. The light still glows in the stone bulb. The serpent still stretches from end to end. The cable still runs to its mysterious source. And the question, the great, enduring, beautiful question, still hangs in the ancient air of the Dendera crypt, waiting for an answer that may be just around the corner or may be another 2,000 years away. This has been the story of the Dendera light bulbs. This has been the story of ancient Egyptian electricity. The walls have spoken. The images have been examined. The evidence has been weighed. The mystery endures. And the ancient lights of Dendera continue to glow, as they have always glowed in the sacred darkness, beneath the stars, beside the eternal river, at the threshold between what we know and what we have yet to discover.